Hello friend, welcome to Sleepy Old World. Get comfortable. Before we go anywhere tonight, if you're enjoying these stories, a like helps more than you would think, and if you want more nights like this one, waiting for you whenever you need them, subscribing costs nothing and means a great deal to me. That is the whole pitch. I will not mention it again tonight. What I would love to know is where you're listening from right now. Maybe you're in a quiet bedroom in Yorkshire with a fan turning slowly in the corner, just enough to move the warm air around. Maybe you're somewhere in Ohio with the air conditioner humming on the other side of the wall, the only sound in the house. Maybe you're lying in the dark in Nova Scotia with the window cracked open, waiting to see if a breeze ever actually comes. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. All right, love. Pull the sheet up just enough to feel covered, the way you would if someone else were tucking it there for you. Are you comfortable? Good. Let's go. Forget the staircase you're picturing right now, the wide one, the one with the carved banister and the portraits climbing the wall beside it, family faces in oil paint looking down at whoever passes below. That staircase is not where we're going tonight. We're going to the other one, the narrow one, the one tucked behind a door covered in green baize, a thick woolen cloth nailed flat against the wood to muffle sound and mark a boundary that every person in the house understood without ever being told twice. Push through that door and the air changes before your eyes do. The carpet ends, the wallpaper ends. What is underfoot now is bare stone, worn into a shallow dip at the centre of each step from feet that have climbed it thousands of times before yours, and what is overhead is a single gas jet turned low, throwing just enough light to keep a person from breaking an ankle, and no more than that. It is the spring of 1883, somewhere in the English countryside, on an estate large enough to have a name people in 3 counties would recognise, and a family whose name is cut into the stone lintel above the front door in letters deep enough to last another 200 years. We are not telling their story tonight. We are telling the other one, the one that never made it into any letter, any diary, any portrait. Maybe she's 19 years old and 3 years into service, lying on a narrow iron bed under a sloped attic ceiling she can touch with her hand without sitting up. Maybe she's older than that, 40 perhaps, with hands that have gone permanently rough at the knuckle, the kind of rough that does not soften even on a Sunday off. Maybe you recognise something in her you did not expect to. The particular tiredness of work that is never quite finished, the habit of moving quietly through a space you're not supposed to be noticed in. You already know this feeling, even if you have never worn an apron in your life. Here is the thing nobody puts in the paintings. The family upstairs will be remembered. Their names are already carved where rain cannot reach them. But it was never their hands that kept this house alive, not really. It was hers, and the housekeepers and the butlers, and a dozen others whose names exist now only in a single yellowing ledger, in an estate office somewhere, if they exist at all. They kept the candles lit and the floors silent and every door closed at exactly the moment it needed closing. They knew which guest drank more than he should, and which daughter received letters she was not meant to receive, and which lord's temper turned ugly after the 3rd glass of port, and not one word of it ever travelled up that staircase we'd just left behind. That is the paradox sitting quietly at the centre of tonight's story. The house remembers the family. The family, in the end, depended entirely on people history never bothered to remember at all. Listen. Somewhere below us, a kitchen clock is ticking through the last hour before anyone upstairs wakes. A coal scuttle scrapes once against a stone floor and goes still. That sound, small and almost nothing, is where we begin. The house we are inside tonight has a name, but let us set that aside for now, because the name does not matter nearly as much as the shape of the place, and the shape is what tells the real story. Picture a great rectangle of stone, 3 stories of family rooms rising above a raised ground floor, with wide windows that catch the morning sun on the eastern face, and a long gravel drive sweeping up to a front door flanked by columns. That much you could have guessed. What you would not guess, unless someone showed you, is that the house has a second skeleton hidden inside the first, a complete and separate circulatory system of corridors, stairs, and small windowless rooms that allowed perhaps 30 people to live and work and move through every hour of every day, almost entirely unseen by the dozen or so people they served. This was not an accident. It was not a leftover from some earlier, cruder age that the Victorians simply never got around to fixing. It was, in fact, the opposite. The deliberate architectural separation of servants from family reached its most refined, most expensive, most thoroughly engineered form precisely in the decades we are visiting tonight, the middle and later years of the 1800s, when a wealthy household's comfort was measured less by how much luxury surrounded the family and more by how completely the labour producing that luxury could be made to disappear. A house like this one might have been built, or substantially rebuilt, only 30 or 40 years earlier, and the people who designed it had thought about the problem of servants the way an engineer thinks about plumbing. Where does it run? How is it hidden? How do you make sure it never backs up into a room where someone might actually have to look at it? The baize door is where this thinking begins, and it is worth lingering on for a moment, because it is such a small thing, and it did such enormous work. A plain wooden door, usually positioned at the point where the family's part of the house met the service corridors, covered on one or both sides with a heavy woolen baize, green most commonly, sometimes a deep red or brown, fixed in place with a pattern of brass studs. The fabric muffled sound, certainly, which mattered enormously in a house where a butler's footstep should never be heard by a sleeping family at 2 a.m. But the baize door did something else too, something almost psychological. It marked a threshold. On one side you were a person who might be addressed, glanced at, acknowledged with a nod. On the other side the rules changed completely, and everyone on both sides knew it the instant the door swung shut behind them. Beyond that door, the world belonged to a different kind of architecture altogether. Corridors here were narrower, ceilings lower, walls left unpapered or papered cheaply, because no family member would ever see them, and therefore no expense needed to be wasted on them. The back stairs, the ones we climbed a moment ago, often ran the full height of the house, in a tight spiral or a steep straight flight, built to be efficient rather than gracious, designed for a person carrying a full coal scuttle in each hand or a tray balanced against one hip, not for a lady in skirts wide enough to brush both walls at once. Some of the grandest houses of the period went further still, building entirely separate staircases for male and female servants, on the theory, openly discussed by household manuals of the era, that unsupervised proximity between footmen and housemaids on a darkened stairwell was an invitation to exactly the kind of trouble no respectable housekeeper wanted on her conscience. And then there were the bells. If you have ever stood in the basement passage of one of these old houses, the kind that survives now as a museum or a hotel, you will have seen the long wooden board mounted on the wall studded with small brass bells of slightly different sizes, each one labelled beneath in careful painted letters: library, morning room, blue bedroom, drawing room. This board was, in its way, one of the most sophisticated pieces of domestic technology of the entire century. A network of wires running invisibly through the house's walls and floors, connecting a small pull or button in nearly every family room to a single point below stairs, where the sound could be heard and the source instantly identified. A guest in the blue bedroom wanting more coal for the fire needed only to reach for a tasselled cord beside the bed. Somewhere 2 floors down, a particular bell would swing and ring, and whoever's job it was to answer, that summons would already be moving before the sound had fully died away. What the bell system actually accomplished, beneath its obvious convenience, was a kind of magic trick performed continuously, every day for decades. It allowed a family to be served constantly without ever having to seek out the person serving them. No one upstairs needed to walk to a kitchen and ask for anything. No one needed to know, particularly, who would appear at the door a few minutes later, only that someone would, reliably, almost supernaturally, exactly when needed, and not a moment sooner. The labour became invisible specifically because the summoning of it had been made so effortless. You rang, something happened. The mechanism of how it happened, the running feet, the dropped task left half-finished elsewhere, the careful arrangement of who answered which bells on which days, none of that was meant to be visible at all. I find something genuinely unsettling about that, the more I sit with it. Not cruel exactly. The family living in this house were not, by most accounts, unusually unkind people, simply unaware in the particular way that comfort makes people unaware of the machinery running beneath their own lives. They knew abstractly that ringing a bell summoned a person. Whether that person had been asleep an hour earlier after working a 16-hour day, whether that person had a name beyond housemaid or footman, whether that person had any feelings whatsoever about being summoned 11 times before breakfast, these were not questions the system was built to raise. That was, in its quiet way, the entire point of the architecture we have just walked through. Not malice, erasure. The two are not the same thing, though they can produce remarkably similar results. Now, let us slow down here for a moment and meet the people themselves, because the bellboard on its own tells you nothing about who actually answered it, and the answer is far more structured, far more rigid than most people expect. A household of this size, 30 indoor servants or thereabouts on a large country estate during the busy season, operated under a hierarchy so precise it would not have embarrassed a regiment. At the very top, below only the family itself, stood the butler. He was, in most great houses, the single most powerful servant in the building, responsible for the wine cellar, the silver, the male staff beneath him, and a great deal of the household's actual financial dealings, since he often kept the household accounts that the master himself barely glanced at. A good butler was worth quite literally more than his weight in the trust placed in him, because he alone among the staff routinely handled money, valuables, and secrets that could ruin a family if mishandled. Running parallel to him, equal in authority though over an entirely separate domain, was the housekeeper. She governed the female staff, the household linen, the store cupboards of sugar and tea and preserved fruit, and the moral conduct of every maid under her roof, a responsibility she took, in most accounts we have from the period, with a seriousness bordering on the religious. The housekeeper's keys, an actual ring of them worn at her waist, or kept in a locked drawer in her own private sitting room, were a kind of symbol in themselves. Whoever held the keys to the linen press and the store cupboard held a particular kind of trust that the family could not easily verify and therefore had to simply extend year after year to a woman they otherwise interacted with only briefly each morning to discuss the day's menus. Below the butler came the footman, often hired in part for their height and their appearance, since they were the staff most visible to guests, standing behind chairs at dinner, opening doors, carrying the silver salver with the day's letters. A tall footman in matching livery was, frankly, something of a status object for the family employing him, and more than one household manual of the period discussed footman height, with a frankness that, read now, feels almost uncomfortable. Two men matched as closely as possible so that the pair flanking the dining room door looked symmetrical to a seated guest. Below the footmen sat the hall boy, usually a child of perhaps 12 or 13, the lowest male position in the house, responsible for boots, knives, coal, and whatever miserable task nobody else wanted. The kind of work that built either a lifetime of service or a lifetime bitterness, depending entirely on how the house above him treated a boy, too young yet to have any power to object. On the female side, beneath the housekeeper, stood the lady's maid, a position of peculiar intimacy we will return to later tonight, because she alone among the staff spent real private hours alone with a family member, dressing her, undressing her, hearing things no other servant ever heard. Below her came the parlour-maid or housemaids proper, responsible for the visible rooms of the house, the drawing-room, the morning-room, the bedrooms, work that demanded a kind of invisibility even more total than the footman's, since a housemaid's entire skill lay in making a room appear to clean itself, fires lit and grates blacked and curtains drawn, before anyone upstairs had opened their eyes to notice the work being done at all. Further down still, in the kitchen ruled the cook, who in a house of this scale held authority nearly equal to the housekeepers, though over food rather than linen, and who in many households was addressed as Mrs. So-and-so regardless of whether she had ever married, a courtesy title that signalled her seniority the way a military rank might. Beneath her the kitchen maid and the scullery maid, the lowest rung of the entire female hierarchy, a girl often no older than 14, hands perpetually raw from cold water and harsh soda crystals, scouring pots in a stone scullery that the cook herself rarely entered. The scullery maid ate last, slept in the smallest room, and was, in the strict logic of the servants' hall, barely senior to nobody at all. What strikes me every time I sit with this structure is how completely it mirrored the family's own world upstairs, rank for rank, deference for deference, almost as though the house could not help but reproduce its own hierarchy at every scale it touched. The servants did not invent this rigidity to spite each other. They inherited it, the same way the family inherited theirs, and within it they built entire lives, entire careers, entire private systems of pride and ambition that had almost nothing to do with how the family upstairs perceived them. A butler who had served 30 years in a great house held himself, among his own kind, with the bearing of a man who had genuinely arrived somewhere. He had. It simply was not a place the people upstairs would have recognized as anywhere at all. It is 5:30 in the morning now, though nobody upstairs would know that, because nobody upstairs is awake to know anything at all. The first person stirring in the entire house tonight, or this morning rather, is the scullery maid, a girl we might call Bess, 14 years old, who has been at this house for 8 months, and who rises in pitch darkness in an attic room she shares with another girl, both of them dressing quickly under cold sheets, because lighting a candle this early is considered an unnecessary expense unless absolutely required. She knows her room by feel. 3 steps to the washstand, the chip on the basin's rim always on the left. She finds her cap by touch and pins it without a mirror because there is no mirror, and because by now her hands know the shape of the task better than her eyes ever did. Bess's first job of the day, before the cook is even awake, before the housekeeper has unlocked a single store cupboard, is the kitchen range, and if you have never had to light and tend a Victorian kitchen range, you genuinely cannot imagine the physical labour involved in simply producing breakfast. The range itself, a vast iron construction set into the kitchen wall, had to be cleared of yesterday's ash, the flues checked, fresh coal carried in from the coal house in a heavy scuttle that strained a 14-year-old's arms even half full, and the whole thing coaxed back to a working heat using kindling, a few precious matches, and a good deal of patience learned through months of failure. A cold range meant a cold breakfast, meant a furious cook, meant a day that started badly for everyone beneath that particular roof. And so this single task, performed in near total darkness by a child most of the family upstairs could not have picked out of a crowd, set the tone for everything that followed. While Bess fights with coal and kindling, elsewhere in the house other doors are opening too. The hall boy is up now, working through the boots. A task that sounds almost comically small until you understand its scale. Every pair of outdoor boots belonging to the master, the sons if there are any staying in the house, any male guests currently in residence, all of it left outside bedroom doors the night before, on the understanding that they would reappear by morning transformed, polished to a deep unbroken shine using blacking, a thick paste applied with one brush and worked to a gleam with another, dry brush entirely separate from the wet one, because mixing the two ruined the finish, and any hallboy who made that mistake learned about it quickly from whoever supervised him. A boot jack, a simple wooden device shaped like a narrow V, stood near the back door for the reverse problem, pulling off a muddy boot without bending or using one's hands, a small mercy for men coming in from the stables or the shooting field with boots too filthy to touch. The housemaids are rising now too, 2 or 3 of them in this particular house, and their morning begins with what the era called doing the grates, a task so universally dreaded among Victorian domestic staff that entire pages of household manuals are devoted to the proper technique for performing it quietly enough not to wake a sleeping family 2 rooms away. Each fireplace in active use, and in a house like this there might be a dozen or more, needed its ash from the previous evening removed entirely, the grate itself black-leaded, a polish made from graphite and applied with a brush to keep the iron from rusting and give it that particular deep matte sheen the era considered properly kept, and then a new fire built and lit, All of this accomplished, ideally, before the room's occupant had stirred enough to notice anyone had been there at all. A housemaid who could light a fire and clean a grate without a single sound, without so much as the scrape of a coal scuttle against stone, was considered genuinely skilled, the domestic equivalent of a surgeon's steady hand. And here is the detail that stops people cold every time I describe it. The detail that makes the whole system suddenly visible in a way it was never meant to be. The fires had to be lit in a strict order, room by room, calculated backwards from when each occupant was expected to wake, so that a lady's bedroom might be done at 6:30 while the drawing room, not needed until later, waited until 8. This meant the housemaids were not simply working hard, they were working to an invisible schedule built entirely around other people's sleep, a schedule that existed nowhere on paper, that lived only in the housekeeper's memory and the accumulated experience of the staff themselves, each of them holding, every single morning, a kind of mental map of exactly which family member would wake when, and exactly how much time remained to make their room warm and clean and ready before that moment arrived. By 6, the kitchen is properly alive. The cook, Mrs. Heron we might call her, though she has never married, is at the range now herself, and the kitchen maid beneath her is preparing the servants' own breakfast, a meal that will be eaten quickly, standing in some houses, sitting in others, before the real work of the family's breakfast begins in earnest. There is a particular smell to a working Victorian kitchen at this hour, coal smoke from the range mixing with the yeasty warmth of bread already proofing for the day, and underneath it something colder, the metallic tang of the copper pans hanging along one wall, each one scoured to a shine the night before using sand and vinegar and a great deal of elbow grease, because a tarnished copper pan reflected badly not on the kitchen maid who had failed to clean it, but on the cook who had failed to make her clean it, responsibility flowing upward through the hierarchy, the same way blame always somehow finds its way to whoever has the least power to deflect it. The knife board sits propped against the scullery wall, a long flat board coated in a fine abrasive paste, used for sharpening and polishing the household's entire collection of kitchen and table knives, a task performed daily because steel of this period dulled and discoloured quickly, and a tarnished blade at the family's table was considered, by some of the stricter housekeepers, a small moral failing on someone's part. Flat irons sit warming near the edge of the range too, heavy wedges of solid iron with a handle, heated directly by the fire and tested constantly against a dampened finger or a scrap of cloth to make sure they were hot enough to press linen smooth, but not so hot they would scorch it. A balance struck through feel alone, no thermometer, no gauge, just years of a housemaid's hand against hot metal, learning exactly what ready felt like. I want to be honest with you about something. When I first read accounts of mornings like this one, written by former servants decades later, I expected exhaustion to be the dominant note, and it is there certainly, but it is not alone. There is also, again and again, a kind of quiet competence that the people performing this work clearly took real pride in. A housemaid who could lay and light 12 fires before 7:30 without waking a soul knew in some private corner of herself that she was extraordinarily good at something, even if the only people who would ever fully appreciate the skill involved were the other servants working alongside her. That pride does not erase the unfairness of the system. It simply existed inside it, the way real human feeling so often does, refusing to stay neatly on one side of a moral ledger or the other. There was one room in this entire house, and only one, where the strict grammar of rank loosened just slightly, where a person could exhale. The servants' hall sat below stairs near the kitchen, a long plain room with a heavy wooden table running its length, benches worn smooth by decades of use, and a fire kept burning year-round, smaller than the kitchen range but enough to take the chill off stone walls that never quite warmed through. This was where the staff ate their meals together, where the housekeeper still sat at the head of the table and the scullery maid still sat nearest the door, the hierarchy never entirely vanishing even here, but where the conversation, once the housekeeper and butler had withdrawn to their own private sitting rooms after the meal's formal portion ended, could finally turn into something resembling actual talk between actual people. It is worth understanding just how rare that was. Everywhere else in the house, every single room, a servant existed in a state of permanent performance, voice pitched a certain way, face arranged a certain way, opinions kept entirely to oneself unless directly and specifically requested, which they almost never were. The servants' hall, in the half hour or so after the senior staff withdrew, was the one space in the entire building where a footman could complain about his aching feet, where a housemaid could mimic very quietly and only for an audience she trusted completely the particular sigh the mistress made when a flower arrangement displeased her. It was where real friendships were built, where genuine affection passed between people who spent every other hour of their day being deliberately professionally invisible to each other in front of anyone who outranked them. And it was where the unspoken rules of the house, rules nobody wrote down because writing them down would have been dangerous, got quietly reinforced generation after generation of staff almost by osmosis. What happens upstairs stays below stairs. That was the closest thing this world had to a commandment, and it covered an enormous range of territory. A housemaid who happened to see a torn letter in a wastepaper basket, a letter that suggested a daughter of the house was corresponding with someone entirely unsuitable, did not report this to the housekeeper, not because she lacked the opportunity, but because doing so would have marked her, instantly and permanently, as someone who could not be trusted with what she saw. The entire system of below-stairs life depended on a kind of collective discretion so total it amounted to its own form of loyalty, stranger and more complicated than simple obedience. This is the part nobody talks about when they imagine Victorian servants. We tend to picture them as either invisible furniture or as bitter put-upon figures counting the days until some imagined revolution. The reality, in the accounts that survive, in the diaries and memoirs written decades later by people who had once worn the apron and the cap, was something closer to a parallel society with its own ethics, its own loyalties, its own fierce internal sense of right and wrong that frequently had almost nothing to do with what the family upstairs would have wanted enforced. Stealing from the family was almost universally considered genuinely wrong, a betrayal of the whole household, servants included. But covering for a fellow servant's small private life, a love affair the housekeeper had expressly forbidden, a night spent somewhere other than the assigned bed, that was something else entirely. That was not betrayal. That was simply what you did for someone who would, without question, do the same for you. Take Thomas, a footman in this house, 24 years old, broad-shouldered in the way that had partly secured him the position, and quietly, carefully, almost desperately in love with one of the housemaids, a girl named Alice who worked 2 floors above the kitchen where he spent most of his day. Below stairs, romance of any kind sat under a thick and permanent cloud of disapproval. Most great houses forbade marriage among the staff outright, unless one party left service entirely, and many housekeepers took it as a point of personal pride to break up any romantic attachment discovered under her roof before it could develop into anything requiring action. The reasoning offered was practical. A married housemaid would soon enough be a pregnant housemaid, and a pregnant housemaid could not continue in service, and a continuous churn of staff leaving to marry was, from the family's perspective, simply inconvenient. So Thomas and Alice did what countless servants in countless houses did before and after them. They became careful, a note left where only the other would find it, tucked behind a loose brick near the boot room. A few stolen minutes in the passage near the wine cellar on the rare occasion their duties happened to overlap there. And, importantly, a small circle of fellow servants who knew exactly what was happening and said, to anyone above them, absolutely nothing at all. The under-housekeeper, a woman with 20 years of service behind her, and very little patience left for being scandalized by things that scandalized nobody who actually lived this life, had apparently known for months and simply chosen, with what Alice later described in old age as a kind of weary, knowing kindness, to look the other way as long as the work kept getting done and nothing became too obvious to ignore. That detail, the looking away, the choosing not to know officially what everybody knew unofficially, runs through nearly every below-stairs account I have come across, and it tells you something important about how this world actually functioned day to day. The official rules, the ones written into household manuals and recited by housekeepers at their sternest, existed in a kind of parallel track alongside an entire unofficial system of mercy, exhaustion and shared understanding among people who all knew, better than anyone upstairs ever would, exactly how hard this life already was without making it harder for each other over something as human as wanting to be loved by somebody at the end of a 16-hour day. If you want to understand the strangest, most intimate relationship in this entire house, you have to look at the lady's maid, and tonight that means looking at Harriet, who has served the mistress of this house for 11 years now, since she herself was barely 20. No other servant occupied quite the position Harriet did. She was not below stairs in the way Bess or Thomas were. Not exactly, though she ate in the servants' hall and slept in a small room not far from theirs. But she spent hours of every single day in a kind of proximity to the family that footmen and housemaids almost never experienced, alone in a dressing room with the mistress, lacing a corset, arranging hair, hearing, whether she wanted to or not, whatever happened to be said while a brush moved slowly through someone's hair in the quiet hour before a dinner party. A lady's maid heard everything eventually. She heard a marriage strained almost to breaking over money the husband would not discuss. She heard which guest the mistress genuinely could not stand and had to be charming toward anyway for 3 entire days of a country house visit. She heard, more than once over 11 years, actual weeping, the kind that happens only in front of someone who has already seen you at your most undressed, literally and otherwise, and who therefore no longer counts in some strange social arithmetic as someone in front of whom you need to perform composure at all. And every single thing Harriet heard, she carried out of that dressing room and never spoke of again. Not in the servants' hall, not to the housekeeper, not even by her own much later account, to herself in any sustained way she allowed conscious thought to settle on. This is the part that I find genuinely remarkable, the longer I sit with it. Harriet's discretion was not enforced the way the rest of the household's rules were enforced, through fear of dismissal, or a housekeeper's sharp word. It went deeper than that. A lady's maid who gossiped about her mistress even once, even to her closest friend among the staff, would have destroyed something far more fragile than her employment. She would have destroyed the only thing that actually made the relationship between mistress and maid bearable for either of them, which was the fiction agreed to silently by both parties, that what passed between them in that dressing room simply did not exist anywhere else. The mistress needed to believe this completely in order to weep in front of Harriet at all. And Harriet, it seems, came over the years to genuinely want to protect that fiction, not merely out of professional obligation, but out of something closer to real loyalty. The strange, lopsided, asymmetrical loyalty that develops between two people who spend years that intimate with each other while remaining, on paper, employer and employee and nothing else. We should pause on the corset for a moment, because it tells you something about the physical reality underneath all this emotional intimacy. Lacing a woman into her corset properly was a genuine skill, requiring real strength in the hands and a careful feel for exactly how much pressure to apply and where, tight enough to achieve the fashionable silhouette of the era, loose enough that the woman could actually breathe through an entire evening of dinner and conversation and standing for hours in a receiving line. Too tight, and the mistress might genuinely faint partway through dinner. An embarrassment that would reflect, again, not on the corset's design, but on the maid who had laced it. Too loose, and the dress would not sit correctly, the line would be wrong, and a woman who had spent the equivalent of a labourer's monthly wage on that single gown would notice immediately and say so, not always gently. The unlacing at the end of the evening, hours later, after the dinner party or the ball had finally ended and the carriages had rattled off down the drive, was its own small ritual, performed in near silence, usually by candlelight, sometimes well past midnight, with both women exhausted in entirely different ways. The mistress exhausted from the performance of the evening, the conversation maintained, the smile held in place for hours regardless of what she actually felt. Harriet exhausted from the physical work and from the simple accumulated weight of having been awake and alert and useful since before dawn that same morning. There is something almost tender in the accounts that survive of this particular nightly moment. Two women alone in candlelight, one slowly being freed from layer after layer of fashionable constraint, the other doing the freeing with hands too practiced now to need to think about the task at all, talking sometimes, in low voices, about absolutely nothing of consequence, simply because the day was finally over, and there was a strange comfort in not being alone for the last few minutes of it. It is worth understanding what the word season actually meant in a house like this one, because it explains why this particular week, this particular spring of 1883, mattered so much more than an ordinary week would have. The London season proper ran roughly from the early spring through midsummer, a stretch of months during which fashionable society moved through a relentless cycle of balls, dinners, garden parties and visits, and a country house of this standing was expected to host its own portion of that cycle, throwing open its doors to guests who arrived not for an evening but for days at a stretch, sometimes a full week, bringing with them not only themselves but their own servants, their own trunks of clothing requiring constant attention, their own particular preferences that the household staff were expected to learn and accommodate within hours of arrival. This single fact, guests bringing their own servants, created a small society within the larger one, and it had its own strict and sometimes absurd rules of precedence. A visiting lady's maid did not simply slot into the household below stairs as an equal among equals. She took her place at table, and in general standing, according to her own mistress's rank, so that a duke's valet might find himself seated, by long and rigid custom, above the resident butler of the house he was merely visiting, regardless of how many years that butler had served, or how completely he ran the place day to day. Imagine the quiet, simmering tension in that, a man who had given 30 years of his working life to a house finding himself outranked at his own dinner table by a stranger's manservant, simply because of whose coat he happened to brush each morning. Below stairs society, in other words, was every bit as obsessed with rank and precedence as the world directly above it, sometimes more so, because the stakes for a servant, professional reputation, future positions, the good opinion of other staff whose word might matter enormously to a future employer, were entirely real even if the world producing those stakes looked, from the outside, like pure theatre. During this particular week, the house was preparing to receive exactly this kind of company, 6 guests arriving over 2 days for what would stretch into nearly a week of entertaining. And the effect on the household's workload was not an addition so much as a multiplication. 6 more sets of clothes requiring brushing and pressing, and the removal of travel dust each evening. 6 more sets of expectations about how early morning tea should be brought, how a fire should be banked, how a window should or should not be left open overnight. The cook had been planning menus for nearly 2 weeks already, working through what the household referred to, with a certain weary precision, as the season's books, ledgers tracking not just cost but variety, since serving the same dish twice to the same set of guests within a single visit was considered, in some households, almost a small social failure on the cook's part. And underneath all of this practical strain ran something else, something the staff understood perhaps more clearly than the family did, which is that a house's entire reputation in the small, intensely watched world of landed society could rise or fall on the quality of a single house party. Guests talked. They talked to each other in London drawing rooms for months afterward about which houses ran smoothly and which ones embarrassed themselves. A cold room here, a poorly timed dinner there, a housemaid glimpsed where she ought not to have been seen. The family's social standing, in other words, depended almost entirely on labour performed by people whose names the guests being impressed would never once think to ask. and whose exhaustion mounting through each long day of the visit was itself the actual price of that smooth, effortless impression the family was so anxious to project. The butler, whose name in this house was Mr. Aldous, carried perhaps the heaviest portion of this particular burden, because the wine and the silver and, in a quiet way, the family's entire financial respectability ran through his hands more directly than anyone else's. He alone knew, for instance, that the master's gambling at cards had grown somewhat heavier over the past 2 years, that certain bills had been settled later than they once were, that a particular piece of family silver, a set of candlesticks given as a wedding gift a generation earlier, had quietly disappeared from the dining room sideboard 6 months ago, and not, as far as Mr. Aldous had ever established, been sold or pawned by anyone he could identify, though he had his private suspicions and had decided, on balance, that voicing them would do more harm to the household than the missing silver itself ever had. A butler who knew too much and said too little was, paradoxically, the single most valuable kind of servant a family could possess, and Mr. Aldous had built an entire 30-year career on knowing precisely where that line sat and never once stepping over it. There is a particular skill almost never written about directly because it was so completely assumed, that every servant in this house had to master within their first weeks of service, and it amounts to something like a discipline of vanishing. If a housemaid was crossing a corridor with an armful of linen and heard a family member approaching from the opposite direction, the correct response was not to greet them, not to step aside with a polite word, but to disappear entirely into a doorway, behind a curtain, down whichever side passage happened to be nearest, so that by the time the family member actually passed through that section of corridor, no servant remained visible at all. Some of the larger and more carefully planned houses built this requirement directly into their floor plans, with small recessed alcoves positioned at intervals along main corridors, specifically so a servant could step into one and effectively cease to exist for the 10 or 15 seconds required for an employer to pass by undisturbed. I want to sit with that for a moment, because it is one of those details that sounds almost unbelievable until you realize how thoroughly it was simply the water everyone swam in. A housemaid was not being rude by avoiding the family's gaze, quite the opposite. Being seen at the wrong moment, caught mid-task with dust on her apron or hair coming loose from its pins, was considered a small failure of professionalism, evidence that she had not managed her work and her presence carefully enough to remain properly invisible. The family, for their part, generally did not register this constant vanishing as anything unusual, because for them it had simply always been this way. Rooms were clean, fires were lit. People who performed these tasks were somehow never quite present at the moment the results were noticed, and questioning how that worked would have felt almost as strange as questioning how daylight worked. This same logic governed the corridors that ran behind and beside the main rooms of the house, a secondary network nearly as extensive as the family's own hallways, allowing a servant to move from the kitchen to a distant bedroom or from the wine cellar to the dining room, almost entirely without crossing paths with anyone they served. Some of these passages ran along the outer edges of rooms, thin enough that a person walking through them could, if the walls were old and slightly warped, occasionally hear fragments of conversation happening on the other side, a fact that every experienced servant learned to simply not mention ever to anyone, because what you overheard through a service passage wall belonged to the same unwritten code as everything else you happened to know, and were never, under any circumstance, going to repeat. The housekeeper's own room, by contrast, was one of the few spaces below stairs that functioned almost like a small private office, and Mrs. Pell, who held that position in this particular house, treated it with something close to reverence. It was here that she met daily with the cook to settle the menus, here that she reviewed the household accounts she herself kept separately from the butlers, here that she conducted what the staff referred to privately, and never within her hearing as the Inquisition, the periodic review of every housemaid's conduct, character, and general moral standing that a good Victorian housekeeper considered as much a part of her duty as managing the linen cupboard. A housekeeper of Mrs. Pell's generation had been trained to believe, genuinely and without much room for doubt, that she stood as a kind of moral guardian over every young woman under her roof, responsible in some real sense for keeping them out of trouble that a careless girl, far from her own family and earning her own wages for perhaps the first time in her life, might otherwise drift toward. This produced a peculiar and sometimes contradictory set of pressures on the women below stairs. Mrs. Pell was by every account that survives of houses like this one, capable of real warmth towards staff she trusted, the kind of housekeeper who quietly arranged an extra half-day off for a housemaid whose mother had fallen ill, who slipped a girl a little something from her own wages when a younger servant's family faced hardship at home. And she was, in the same breath, capable of dismissing a housemaid on the spot for behaviour that, viewed from any distance at all, looked considerably less serious than the punishment suggested. A flirtation glimpsed once too often, a late return from a half-day out that smelled faintly of more freedom than a respectable girl ought to have taken for herself. The two sides of Mrs. Pell were not really in contradiction. They were the same instinct, protective and controlling at once, applied with a consistency that made her, depending entirely on which housemaid you asked, either the closest thing to a mother some of these girls had in this house, or the single greatest threat to anything resembling a private life they would ever face under this roof. By 11 in the morning, the kitchen has become something closer to a small, well-drilled army preparing for battle, and Mrs. Heron, the cook, commands it with an authority that brooks essentially no argument from anyone, including on occasion the housekeeper herself, since the two women's domains overlapped just enough to produce the occasional quiet skirmish over whose decision actually governed a particular question. Tonight's dinner, the first formal evening of the house party now gathering, will run to perhaps 9 or 10 courses: a soup, a fish course, an entree, a joint of meat, game, a sweet course or two, cheese, and finally dessert, each one requiring its own preparation timeline worked backward from the moment the gong would sound and the family and their guests would move toward the dining room. The kitchen maid beneath Mrs. Heron, a steady young woman named Edith who has worked her way up from scullery duties over 4 years and harbours real ambition toward becoming a cook herself one day in a smaller house of her own, spends much of the morning on preparation that will never be visible in the finished dish at all. Stock simmering for hours on the back of the range, its surface skimmed repeatedly to keep it perfectly clear. Vegetables cut into shapes precise enough that a guest glancing at her plate would register only an impression of careful elegance, without ever consciously noticing the uniformity that produced it. Sauces that had to be started, reduced and finished at exactly the right intervals, since a sauce allowed to sit even slightly too long would separate or dull in a way that an experienced eye, and there were several experienced eyes seated at tonight's table, would notice instantly. There is a kind of invisible mathematics running through a kitchen like this one that I find genuinely impressive the longer I think about it. Mrs. Heron is not simply cooking, she is solving a continuous logistics problem with no margin for error, calculating exactly how many minutes before service each element needs to begin, accounting for how little usable surface the range actually has at any given moment, that certain dishes must rest while others finish, that the footman carrying plates upstairs will take a predictable but not perfectly fixed amount of time to deliver each course, and that every single element of a meal touching the table within seconds of every other element has to converge at precisely the right moment despite having started cooking at wildly different times throughout the day. She holds this entire schedule in her head. There is no written timeline pinned to the wall. There is simply Mrs. Heron glancing at the clock, calling out instructions in a voice that has long since stopped needing to be raised because everyone beneath her has learnt, through repetition and the occasional sharp correction, exactly what each tone of her voice means. Edith, watching all this, is learning more than technique, though the technique itself is considerable. She is learning a kind of command, a way of holding authority over a room of younger, more junior staff that does not depend on volume or threat so much as absolute. demonstrated competence, the kind that earns deference because everyone beneath you can plainly see you know more than they do and could, if required, perform their task better than they currently can themselves. This is in its own way one of the more genuine meritocracies operating anywhere in this house. The family upstairs inherited their position. Mrs. Heron earned hers, dish by dish, year by year, starting as a kitchen maid herself decades earlier in a house she rarely speaks of now, climbing a ladder that had nothing to do with birth and everything to do with whether the food on the table, every single night, regardless of how she herself felt or what worries sat on her mind that particular day, came out right. Bess, the scullery maid we met before dawn, spends most of this same stretch of morning at the deep stone sink, hands submerged for hours a stretch in water gone tepid and grey with use, scrubbing pots and pans the moment Mrs. Heron or Edith set them down, because a kitchen running a 10-course dinner cannot afford to let dirty cookware accumulate even for 20 minutes before it is needed again, clean, for the next stage of preparation. The soda crystals she uses to cut through grease have already begun, 8 months into this position, to roughen the skin of her hands in a way that will, by the time she is 20, have become essentially permanent, a small physical record written onto her body by years of exactly this task, performed exactly this way, in exactly this stone room that the family upstairs has, in all likelihood, never once set foot inside. There is a particular hour in the early afternoon, between the clearing of the family's luncheon and the beginning of the long climb toward dinner, when the household below stairs experiences something almost like a held breath. The morning's frantic pace eases, the evening's frantic pace has not yet begun, and in this narrow window, perhaps 40 minutes on a good day, the servants' hall fills with people who are for once not actively performing a task, sitting with mending in their laps or a cup of tea cooling untouched in front of them simply because holding it is more restful than drinking it. This is when Alice and Thomas, the housemaid and footman whose careful hidden affection we touched on earlier, find perhaps their only reliable stretch of overlapping free time in the entire day, and it tells you something about the texture of below-stairs romance that their version of intimacy, most afternoons, consisted of sitting at opposite ends of the same long table, exchanging perhaps a dozen words, a private joke referring back to something that had happened a week earlier, a glance held a half-second longer than strictly necessary before one of them looked away first. Nobody watching closely would have called it romantic. Everybody at that table, every single person present, understood exactly what it was. Edith, the kitchen maid with her ambitions toward becoming a cook herself, uses this window most days to read, an unusual habit among the female staff that the previous housekeeper had apparently disapproved of, and Mrs. Pell, somewhat more permissive on this particular point, allows so long as it does not interfere with duties. She reads whatever she can borrow, a penny periodical passed down from one of the upstairs housemaids, who occasionally finds discarded copies in the family's own rooms, a cookery book Mrs. Heron has lent her with the stern instruction that it return undamaged, and once memorably, an actual novel that circulated through 3 different pairs of hands below stairs over the course of a single month, each reader given perhaps 2 days before passing it along, the kind of quiet collective generosity that never once required anyone to ask for it directly. What strikes me about this stretch of the day is how ordinary it is in the best possible sense. Strip away the uniforms, the strict rank, the architecture built specifically to keep these people unseen by the family they served, and what remains in this 40-minute window looks remarkably like any group of co-workers anywhere, in any century, finding small pockets of genuine connection inside a working day that otherwise allows for almost none. They complain quietly about aching feet and a particularly demanding guest already proving difficult 2 days into a week-long visit. They tease each other. The hall boy, not much more than a child really, gets ribbed gently about a girl from the village he has apparently been mooning over on his half-days, and he turns a shade of red that makes even Mrs. Pell, passing through briefly to collect something from her room, suppress what might on a more relaxed woman have been an actual smile. And then, inevitably, the window closes. A bell sounds somewhere, faint but unmistakable, and whoever's name corresponds to that particular ring rises without complaint, sets down whatever small comfort they had been holding, and goes. The conversation does not stop so much as simply thin out person by person, until the servants' hall holds only whoever's afternoon happens to be briefly, momentarily quiet, and even they know it will not last. This is the rhythm of an entire below-stairs day, work and the smallest possible respite and work again, repeated so many thousands of times across a career in service that it eventually stops registering as exhausting and simply becomes, for better or worse, the only shape a day has ever taken. Outside, in the stable yard and the kitchen garden, a different rhythm runs alongside this one. The head gardener, a man named Joseph who answers to neither the butler nor the housekeeper, but reports directly to the family's land agent, has spent the morning ensuring the kitchen garden's early produce, the first tender lettuces, a handful of forced strawberries grown under glass at considerable trouble and expense, purely so the family might enjoy fruit weeks before its natural season, arrives at the kitchen door at precisely the moment Mrs. Heron needs it, and not a moment before, since produce left waiting even an hour loses some fraction of the perfection that justified growing it under glass in the first place. The coachman and the stable hands maintain their own separate hierarchy entirely, eating at their own table in a room near the stables rather than the main servants' hall. A small but telling detail about just how many distinct social layers a single large estate could contain, each one with its own internal rules, its own pecking order, its own version of the same basic human need to know, clearly and without ambiguity, exactly where one stood relative to everyone else nearby. The first carriage of guests arrives a little after 4 in the afternoon, and the household has been braced for it since well before luncheon. Every surface that might conceivably be glimpsed by an arriving visitor checked, rechecked, and checked again by a housemaid sent specifically for that purpose. Mr. Aldous himself stands ready near the front entrance, composed into the particular blank, attentive expression that a good butler perfects over decades, an expression that communicates total readiness while revealing absolutely nothing about whatever he might actually be thinking, which today includes a fair amount of private calculation about where exactly 6 additional sets of luggage and 2 visiting servants are going to fit into a household routine already stretched close to its limit. A lord and his wife descend from the carriage first, followed by their unmarried daughter and a friend of the family travelling with them, each one carrying the particular unhurried confidence of people for whom arrival has never once involved any actual labour, their trunks already being lifted down by footmen, the lady's maid travelling with them stepping out last, smoothing her own skirts before turning to assess, with a quick practised eye, exactly how this household compared to others she had served in. Below stairs, this assessment mattered enormously, though the family arriving would never have guessed it carried any weight at all. A visiting lady's maid, who returned to her own household afterward, describing this house as well-run, properly staffed, comfortable, was performing a kind of advertising that no amount of effort from the family itself could have purchased. A visiting maid who instead complained, in some other servants' hall weeks later, about cold rooms or slow service, was inflicting real damage on a reputation the family upstairs would never even know had been harmed, or by whom. This particular visiting lady's maid, a sharp-eyed woman perhaps 35 years old, who introduced herself below stairs simply as Miss Carr, settled into the household hierarchy with the easy, slightly proprietary confidence of someone accustomed to taking precedence wherever she landed. By the strict and largely unspoken rules of below-stairs society, her position, drawn directly from her mistress's rank, sat above several of the resident staff, including, technically, the under-housekeeper, a fact that produced exactly the kind of quiet, simmering friction such situations always did. Nobody said anything about it directly. Nobody needed to. It expressed itself instead in small things: who was served first at the servants' table during Miss Carr's stay, whose opinion on a question of household routine got deferred to without comment, whose private irritation, carefully masked in front of the visitor, found its way out later in a slightly sharper word to a housemaid who had done nothing at all to deserve it. Mr. Aldous, watching all this with the long patience of a man who had managed a great many house parties over 30 years, knew better than to intervene directly in any of it. His job, as he understood it, was to ensure the machinery of the house ran without friction visible to a single person above stairs, regardless of how much friction existed below it, and so he simply absorbed the small frustrations of his own staff with a kind of weary, practiced calm, occasionally finding a quiet moment to remind the under-housekeeper gently that the visit would end in 6 days and that 6 days viewed properly was not very long at all in the scheme of a 30-year career. What none of the family upstairs would ever fully appreciate, settling into their rooms and ringing for hot water and fresh towels within minutes of arrival, was just how much additional labour their presence had instantly created, multiplied across every single department of the house at once. The housemaids now had 4 more rooms to clean daily, 4 more sets of linen to manage, 4 more fires to keep tended through the day and night. The kitchen now fed not 8 people at the main table but 14, with the visiting servants adding 2 more mouths below stairs as well, 2 more sets of preferences and habits to learn and accommodate within the space of a single afternoon. The stables had 4 more horses to manage, 4 more sets of harness to clean, a coachman and 2 grooms travelling with the guests who needed feeding, housing and integrating into a yard hierarchy every bit as particular as the one operating inside the main house itself. A single carriage rolling up a gravel drive, in other words, set off a kind of quiet seismic event throughout the entire below-stairs world, one that the family experienced as nothing more than the simple, effortless pleasure of welcoming friends into a beautifully run home. By 6 in the evening, the entire house has turned its full attention toward a single event still nearly 2 hours away, and the choreography required to produce one formal dinner, viewed in its complete and proper scope, is genuinely extraordinary. Upstairs, Harriet has already begun the long process of dressing the mistress, a sequence that for a formal evening with guests stretches well beyond the relatively simple version performed each morning, since tonight calls for a different gown entirely, heavier, more elaborate, requiring its own particular underpinnings, its own jewellery selected and fastened with hands steady enough not to fumble a clasp at the back of a neck, angled awkwardly toward a mirror. The hair alone, for an evening of this importance, might occupy the better part of an hour, built up and pinned in a style considerably more elaborate than the daytime arrangement, sometimes incorporating false hairpieces if the mistress's own hair lacked sufficient volume for the current fashion, a fact that polite society understood perfectly well and never once mentioned aloud. Harriet works with the particular silent concentration of someone who has performed this exact task hundreds of times and still refuses to let it become careless, because tonight, of all nights, with visiting guests watching closely and comparing what they see to every other house party they have recently attended, a single loose pin or a slightly crooked hem would matter in a way it simply would not on an ordinary evening at home. Downstairs in the dining room, 2 of the footmen, Thomas among them, are completing their own elaborate preparation, laying the table according to a precise diagram that exists, in this house, both as a remembered tradition and as an actual drawn plan kept in a drawer for reference, since a formal table for 14 guests required exact placement of an enormous quantity of silver, glassware and china, each piece positioned to the width of a finger from its neighbours, candles arranged to throw flattering light without dripping wax onto a tablecloth that had taken a laundry maid the better part of a full day to press into perfect, unbroken smoothness. The silver itself, polished earlier in the week by the footmen using a paste that left their fingertips faintly stained for hours afterward, gleams under the gaslight in a way that took real, sustained labour to produce and that not a single guest sitting down tonight would ever think to credit to anyone specific at all. Here is the part of the evening that I find most quietly remarkable every time I picture it properly. The actual serving of a formal Victorian dinner was a piece of genuine performance art, choreographed down to the smallest gesture, and the footman executing it had trained for months, sometimes years, to make an enormously complicated sequence of actions look completely effortless. Each course arrived from the kitchen via the back passages we discussed earlier, carried up narrow service stairs by whichever footman or hallboy was assigned that particular run, handed off at the dining room's service door to whichever footman stood ready inside, served to each guest in a strict order determined by rank, beginning with the most senior lady present and working outward, the entire sequence repeated identically for every single course of a meal that might run 2.5 hours from the first soup to the final cheese. A footman serving at table was trained never to reach across a guest, never to let a serving spoon clink audibly against a dish, never to allow his own shadow to fall across a guest's plate while presenting a course from the left side, the correct side, always, for service of this kind. He learned to anticipate a glass needing refilling before the guest had finished noticing it was nearly empty. To clear a plate the instant cutlery was set down in the particular resting position that signalled completion, a small visual code every diner of this class understood, and every footman had been drilled to read instantly and without conscious thought. Thomas, watching the dining room door from his position near the sideboard, was performing, in essence, a kind of silent, continuous calculation throughout the entire meal, tracking 14 separate guests, 14 separate plates, 14 separate glasses, adjusting his own movement constantly to a rhythm nobody at the table consciously registered at all, beyond the vague, pleasant sense that the evening was proceeding smoothly, as though by magic, exactly the way a well-run house was simply supposed to feel. It is during the third course, the fish, that something happens which never quite became a crisis, only because 3 different servants, none of them coordinating with each other in any visible way, each independently understood exactly what needed to happen and simply did it. The friend of the family travelling with tonight's guests, a gentleman who had clearly enjoyed the sherry before dinner rather more thoroughly than the occasion strictly called for, began telling a story at table that started innocently enough and was by its second sentence heading somewhere considerably less innocent, the kind of anecdote involving a mutual acquaintance marriage and a scandal everyone present apparently knew about but nobody was supposed to discuss in front of the unmarried daughter seated nearby. Mr. Aldous, standing near the door with the particular stillness of a man who misses absolutely nothing happening at his own table, caught the shift in the story's direction perhaps a half-second before most of the seated guests did, and without any visible change of expression whatsoever, simply stepped forward and addressed a quiet, perfectly timed question to the gentleman about which wine he would prefer with the next course, a question that required an answer, that required the gentleman to pause his story to actually consider it, and that gave the mistress of the house, watching from the other end of the table, just enough of an opening to redirect the conversation entirely before the anecdote could resume its original, unfortunate trajectory. I want to be honest about how impressive this is, because it is the kind of skill that leaves absolutely no trace afterward, the kind nobody at that table would ever think to thank Mr. Aldous for, partly because most of them never consciously registered that anything had needed managing at all. He had not corrected a guest. He had not drawn attention to the awkwardness in any way a single person present could later describe specifically. He had simply instantly created a small gap in the conversation's momentum and let the natural authority of the hostess fill it, a piece of social engineering performed in under 3 seconds by a man who had spent 30 years learning to read a room full of strangers and predict, with something approaching genuine precision, exactly where a sentence was heading before the speaker himself had fully decided. Meanwhile, Thomas, 2 steps away near the sideboard, had caught something else entirely. A guest's wine glass tipped at an angle that suggested it was about to be knocked over by an enthusiastic gesture mid-anecdote, and he had already shifted his weight, ready to intercept the moment if it came, though in this case it did not, the gentleman's hand settling rather than swinging, the crisis that might have happened simply evaporating into one that never quite did. This is the part of service work that almost nobody outside it ever sees or thinks about. An enormous portion of a footman's actual skill is not the visible serving of food at all. It is this constant, invisible readiness, a permanent state of attention held for hours at a stretch, anticipating disasters that mostly never arrive, because the readiness itself, multiplied across an entire trained staff working in silent coordination, is precisely what prevents them from arriving in the first place. Below stairs, simultaneously, the servants' own dinner proceeds at its own considerably less formal pace, those staff not currently required upstairs eating together in the servants' hall. The meal somewhat plainer than what travels up to the family, but by no means poor, since a well-run house generally fed its staff decently on the reasonable understanding that hungry, resentful servants made for a poorly functioning household in every other respect. The conversation here, lacking any audience that mattered, ranges freely over whatever has caught anyone's attention that day. A piece of village gossip Bess heard from her mother on her last half-day out, a complaint about the visiting coachman's manner toward the resident stable hands, a few quiet, careful words exchanged between Alice and Thomas across the table, words that carried, to anyone who knew to listen for it, considerably more than their plain content suggested. By the time the family's dinner finally concludes, well past 10 in the evening, the kitchen has already begun its own enormous task of clearing and washing, an undertaking that will not finish for hours yet, every piece of the silver and china that travelled upstairs needing to travel back down, be washed, dried, and returned to its proper place before anyone below stairs can finally consider this particular day complete. Edith and Bess work through this final stretch with the specific, grim efficiency of people who know exactly how much remains and exactly how tired they already are, a combination that produces, somewhat counterintuitively, a kind of focused calm rather than panic, since panic has never once made a stack of dirty plates disappear any faster than steady, unhurried work eventually does. Upstairs, in the half hour or so before the family and their guests finally make their way to bed, a different and gentler ritual unfolds, one that depended on tools so specific to this period that most of them have vanished almost entirely from ordinary life now, surviving only in museum cases and the occasional antique shop where nobody quite remembers what half of them were originally for. A housemaid, working ahead of the family's actual retirement, moves through each occupied bedroom, turning down the bed itself, folding back the top sheet and the heavy coverlet at a precise diagonal angle that every house seemed to insist on slightly differently, checking that the fire had been banked correctly to burn low and steady through the night, without either dying out in the cold hours before dawn or, worse, flaring dangerously while everyone slept. In colder months, and this particular spring evening still carried a real chill once the sun had properly set, a copper warming pan would have been carried from room to room, a flat-lidded vessel on a long wooden handle filled with hot coals from the kitchen range, and moved briefly back and forth beneath the sheets to take the worst of the evening damp off the linen before anyone actually climbed into bed. The pan itself, polished to a deep coppery shine by whichever housemaid had been assigned to the household's metalwork that week, made a particular soft, hollow sound as it slid across a mattress, a sound that, if you grew up in a house like this one, became so thoroughly associated with the approach of sleep that some elderly former servants, interviewed decades later about their working lives, mentioned that exact sound, unprompted, as one of the things they remembered most vividly about service at all. Candles were extinguished now too throughout the house, room by room, using small metal snuffers shaped rather like a tiny pair of scissors fitted with a small cup at the tip, designed to pinch out a flame cleanly without scattering hot wax or sending up the acrid little puff of smoke that a simple pinch of the fingers, or worse, blowing the flame out directly, tended to produce. A good housemaid kept several of these distributed through the house, on mantelpieces, on bedside tables, small unremarkable objects that nonetheless represented exactly the kind of quiet domestic engineering this entire world ran on. Somebody at some point having thought carefully about the precise problem of how to put out a candle elegantly, and having solved it so completely that the solution simply became furniture, present in every room, used 1,000 times without anyone above stairs ever once wondering who had decided it needed to exist. By 11:30, the family's portion of the house has gone largely dark and silent, gas jets turned low or extinguished entirely in rooms no longer occupied, and the particular hush that settles over a great house at this hour is its own kind of atmosphere, heavy curtains and thick carpets absorbing whatever small sounds remain, the building itself seeming to exhale after a long day of performing, for its guests, the appearance of effortless, gracious ease. Harriet has finally finished with the mistress, the corset unlaced, the jewellery returned to its case, the 100 strokes of the hairbrush completed in the particular comfortable silence that settles between two women who have done this exact task together for 11 years and no longer need to fill the time with conversation unless either one genuinely wants to. Thomas and the other footman have cleared the dining room entirely, the last of the silver locked away in Mr. Aldous' pantry, a small room he treats with the seriousness of a bank vault because, in a meaningful sense, that is exactly what it functions as. And below stairs, finally, the household's own day approaches something resembling an end, though not quite yet, not for everyone. Edith and Bess remain in the kitchen and scullery, working through the last of the washing up by the light of a single lamp. Their movements slower now, deliberate in the particular way exhausted hands become deliberate, careful not to drop or chip anything this late in a day that has already asked so much of them. Mrs. Heron has retired to her own small room off the kitchen passage, the only senior member of staff who keeps quarters that close to her actual workplace, a choice she made years ago and has never seen reason to change, since a cook needed, she always said, to be near enough to hear if something in the kitchen went wrong overnight. A fire left unattended, a smell of something burning that nobody else would notice in time. It is close to midnight when the servants' hall fills one final time for the day, and this gathering, the last of several, carries a different quality than any of the others, because by this hour both Mr. Aldous and Mrs. Pell have withdrawn fully to their own rooms, leaving the remaining staff, the footmen, the younger housemaids, Edith once the washing up finally ends, in a space that belongs, for perhaps the only uninterrupted half hour of the entire day, almost entirely to themselves. The fire has burnt down to a low, steady glow. Someone has found from somewhere the heel of a loaf and a bit of cheese nobody upstairs will miss, and this gets passed around the table along with whatever conversation the day has saved up. This is when the actual arithmetic of a servant's life tends to surface, not as complaint exactly, more as a kind of shared wary accounting that everyone present already understood in their bones but occasionally needed to say aloud anyway. A housemaid in a house of this size and standing might earn, in the year we are visiting, something in the neighbourhood of £12 to £16 annually, paid quarterly, with board and lodging provided on top of that wage, a sum that sounds, set against the cost of food and rent a labouring family outside service might pay, almost generous, until you set it against the hours actually worked to earn it. A day beginning at 5:30 and not properly ending until well past 11, 6 days a week without exception, the 7th given over to church in the morning and whatever remained of a Sunday afternoon. This added up, across a full year, to something approaching 4,000 hours of labour, an amount that, divided honestly across 52 weeks, left remarkably little that could fairly be called rest. And then there was the half-day granted once a week if the household ran on generous terms, once a fortnight if it did not, a handful of hours in which a servant might walk into the nearest village, visit family if they lived close enough, or simply sit somewhere that was not this house, breathing air that did not smell faintly of coal smoke and blacking and someone else's dinner. Bess, 14 years old and 8 months into her very first position, found these half-days almost disorienting at first. She admitted once to Edith in a rare unguarded moment, because she had genuinely forgotten, in the rhythm of constant work, what it felt like to have an hour with absolutely nothing required of her, and the freedom of it had taken some getting used to before it stopped feeling, faintly, like she was doing something wrong simply by sitting still. It is here, in this late hour, that the real unwritten rules of below-stairs life finally get spoken aloud rather than simply lived by instinct, and tonight the conversation turns, as it occasionally does, to a story that happened in this very house some years before any of the current younger staff arrived, a story Mrs. Heron alone among those present actually witnessed firsthand and tells now in a low voice, partly as instruction and partly perhaps simply because some stories need telling occasionally or they start to feel like they never happened at all. A housemaid years earlier had found herself with child, unmarried, a situation that in the strict moral universe of Victorian service should have meant instant dismissal, the loss of her character reference, and very possibly a future with no respectable employment open to her ever again. A fate genuinely as serious as it sounds, since a servant dismissed without a good character reference from her previous employer could find herself effectively unemployable in any household that mattered. The entire system of domestic service running on a network of written references that followed a person for the whole of their working life. What happened instead, according to Mrs. Heron's telling, was that the housekeeper of that earlier era, a woman long since retired and likely passed on by now, had quietly arranged for the girl to be sent, on the pretext of caring for an ailing aunt, to a relative's house some distance away for several months, during which time the child was born and arrangements made, through channels nobody below stairs ever discussed openly even among themselves, for its care. The girl returned afterward, resumed her position, and continued in service at this house for several more years before eventually marrying and leaving entirely, her character reference intact, her secret known to perhaps 4 or 5 people in the entire household, and never once mentioned again by any of them, not to her, not to each other, not even evidently decades later, until tonight in this low voice, to a table of younger staff who needed, Mrs. Heron apparently judged, to understand exactly what loyalty among servants could actually mean when it mattered most. Mr. Aldous himself, listening to this story from the doorway of the servants' hall, having returned briefly for something he had forgotten in his own pantry, says nothing as he passes through, though Mrs. Heron catches his eye for just a moment and something passes between the two of them, an old, wordless acknowledgement between people who have worked under this particular roof together for the better part of 3 decades, and have, between them, witnessed considerably more than either has ever spoken of to anyone currently sitting at that table. Mr. Aldous came to this house at 22, a young footman with good references and steadier hands than most, and rose, over the better part of his working life, through every rank a male servant could occupy in a great house, footman to under butler to butler, a climb that took the better part of 15 years and that he speaks of, on the rare occasions he speaks of it at all, with a kind of quiet, settled pride that has nothing performative about it. He has, in 30 years, served 2 generations of this family, the current master's own father before him, and he holds somewhere in his memory an entire private archive of this family's history that exists nowhere else, not in any letter, not in any portrait, not in the family's own collective memory of itself, because families forget things about themselves that the people serving them never have the luxury of forgetting. He remembers the current master as a boy, difficult in particular ways that the family's own polished public memory of their son's childhood has long since smoothed over entirely. He remembers a death in the family, years ago now, handled below stairs with a discretion and a quiet, competent grief management that the family upstairs experienced simply as the house somehow continuing to function correctly even on its worst possible day, never once registering how much deliberate effort that continuity actually required from people whose own private feelings about the death, genuine in several cases, were never once asked after by anyone above stairs at all. I find myself thinking, more than I expected to, about what exactly kept a man like Mr. Aldous in this particular position for 30 years, when by any reasonable accounting the family he served so completely barely registered him as a full person at all, certainly never asked him a single question about his own life, his own family, whether he had ever wanted children of his own, whether 30 years of service had cost him anything he might, in some private hour, have wished he had instead. The honest answer, as best I can reconstruct it from the accounts that survive of men in positions like his, is complicated, and it resists the simple story we might prefer to tell about it. Part of it was certainly practical. A butler's position, secured after 15 years of careful climbing, represented an enormous accumulated investment that leaving would simply throw away, and the alternatives available to a man in his 50s with no other trade were genuinely limited. Part of it was status, real even if entirely confined to a world the family upstairs never saw. The particular respect Mr. Aldous commanded below stairs, among other butlers in neighbouring houses, within the whole intricate social fabric of senior service staff that operated almost like its own profession with its own honours and its own forms of advancement. But part of it, and I do not think this part should be dismissed simply because it complicates the story, was something closer to genuine attachment, to this house specifically, to certain members of this family specifically, a kind of loyalty that had grown, slowly and almost without his noticing, into something real regardless of how lopsided and unacknowledged it remained. He had, after all, watched the current master grow from a difficult boy into a man, had been present in his own quiet, peripheral way for nearly every significant event of that man's entire life: marriages, births. The slow accumulation of an adult character Mr. Aldous had, in some sense, helped form simply by being a steady, reliable presence throughout a childhood that, from what little Mr. Aldous has ever let slip, was not always an easy one for reasons that had nothing to do with money. You cannot spend 30 years that close to a person's life, even from below stairs, even entirely unacknowledged, without something genuine growing in the space between service and simple human proximity. That something does not erase the unfairness of the system that produced it. It exists alongside that unfairness, awkwardly, the way real feeling so often does, refusing the tidy moral categories we might prefer to sort it into. There is a particular category of secret that ran through nearly every great house of this period, different in its specifics from one household to the next, but remarkably consistent in its basic shape. And it is worth naming a few examples plainly, because the abstraction of secrecy means rather less than the actual texture of what was being kept quiet. A son's gambling debts, settled by a father who never once mentioned the sum allowed to anyone but his butler, who alone handled the actual correspondence with the creditors involved. A daughter's correspondence with a young man entirely unsuitable in the family's eyes, conducted through letters that a housemaid retrieved daily from a particular hollow in the garden wall, and delivered unread directly into the daughter's own hand, never once mentioning the arrangement to the housekeeper, despite knowing perfectly well that doing so was, technically, exactly the kind of thing she had been instructed to report. A wife's private unhappiness, sometimes expressed in nothing more than the particular quality of silence Harriet learned to recognize during certain stretches of certain years, was its own kind of secret, never named directly even between mistress and maid, simply absorbed and accommodated through small practical kindnesses, a fire kept burning a little longer on a difficult evening, a quiet word to the cook ensuring a particular comfort food appeared at dinner without anyone needing to ask for it specifically. A husband's drinking, in some households considerably heavier than in others, produced its own set of unspoken protocols among staff. Exactly how much should be poured before dinner without being asked again. Exactly which evenings called for a footman to remain a little closer at hand than usual, in case steadying a hand or a step became suddenly, briefly necessary. None of this, and this is the detail I think matters most, was ever discussed as policy. Nobody sat the staff down and explained the rules for managing a master's drinking or a daughter's secret letters. Each individual servant simply absorbed, through observation and instinct and the accumulated wisdom passed quietly from more senior staff to more junior staff over months and years, exactly what needed protecting and exactly how to protect it without ever appearing to be protecting anything at all. This is, when you sit with it properly, an extraordinarily sophisticated social skill, the kind that gets entirely written out of how we tend to imagine domestic servants as simple passive figures performing simple passive tasks. The actual skill required to manage a household's secrets correctly, day after day, year after year, without a single misstep that might expose either the family's vulnerability or the servant's own complicity, was considerable, and it was exercised almost entirely by people the historical record has decided were not interesting enough to remember individually at all. This same discretion extended, perhaps most delicately of all, to matters of health that a family preferred kept entirely private. A daughter sent away suddenly for several months to recover her health, with no further explanation offered to visitors who asked after her, might genuinely be recovering from an illness, or might be managing something else entirely that the family had decided, for reasons of its own, required a more discreet cover story. The staff who packed her trunks, who knew her actual destination, who understood considerably more about the true situation than the family ever directly told them, simply maintained, when questioned by visiting servants or curious neighbours, the same polite fiction the family itself had constructed, never once breaking character even in the privacy of their own servants' hall, because some secrets, the genuinely serious ones, were understood to be off-limits even for the relative freedom of late-night conversation among trusted staff. I keep returning, the more I think about this particular dimension of the work, to how strange it must have felt, holding this much private knowledge about people who held almost no corresponding knowledge about you. Harriet knew more about the actual emotional reality of her mistress's marriage than the mistress's own closest friends did. Mr. Aldous knew the precise state of the family's finances more intimately than several of the family's own adult children did. And yet the family, by and large, knew almost nothing real about Harriet or Mr. Aldous in return. Not where they had come from before service, not what they hoped for in whatever years remained to them beyond this house, not whether either of them had ever loved anyone, lost anyone, grieved anyone, beyond the barest practical facts required to employ them at all. The intimacy ran entirely in one direction. That asymmetry, more than almost anything else about this world, is the detail I find myself sitting with longest. It nearly went wrong for Alice and Thomas once, about 4 months ago now, in a way that the servants' hall still occasionally references in the particular shorthand that develops among people who have shared a genuine scare together. Thomas had slipped down to the wine cellar passage one evening on the pretext of fetching something for Mr. Aldous, a pretext that happened to be entirely true that particular night, and Alice, finishing a late task nearby, had found a few stolen minutes to meet him there, exactly the kind of overlap they had learned, over many months, to manufacture without ever quite admitting to themselves how deliberately they were manufacturing it. What they had not accounted for was Mrs. Pell herself, taking an unscheduled turn through that same passage to check on a delivery of preserved fruit she expected the grocer's boy to have left there earlier that day. The footsteps reached them with perhaps 3 seconds of warning, just enough for Alice to step back, smooth her apron, and arrange her face into something approximating ordinary composure before Mrs. Pell rounded the corner and found, ostensibly, a housemaid and a footman standing a respectable distance apart discussing, with rather more enthusiasm than the topic strictly warranted, whether the fruit delivery had in fact arrived. Mrs. Pell, by every account given afterwards, said absolutely nothing in that moment beyond a brief, businesslike instruction about the fruit, and continued on her way without so much as a backward glance, leaving Alice and Thomas standing in the cellar passage in a silence that Alice later described, recounting it to Edith weeks afterward in a much lighter tone than the actual moment had carried, as the longest 10 seconds of her entire life up to that point. What makes this small episode worth telling at all is what happened, or rather what did not happen, in the days following. Mrs. Pell never raised the matter, not with Alice, not with Thomas, not with anyone else below stairs as far as either of them could ever determine. No formal warning was issued. No private conversation occurred. The under-housekeeper's own account, given to Mrs. Heron some time afterward in one of those quiet exchanges between senior staff that occasionally happened when the two women trusted each other enough to speak plainly, was simply that she had seen exactly what she expected to see: 2 young people behaving foolishly but not, in her considered judgment, doing any actual harm to the household by it. and that intervening directly would have created considerably more disruption than the situation itself warranted. This is, I think, one of the more genuinely human details in this entire story. The gap between what the rules technically required and what an experienced, tired, fundamentally decent housekeeper actually chose to enforce. Mrs. Pell had by that point run this particular household's female staff for nearly 15 years. She had seen this exact small drama play out, in one form or another, more times than she could probably count, and she had learned, the way long experience teaches almost everyone eventually, that some rules exist mainly to be referenced rather than rigidly applied. That a housekeeper's real job was not the mechanical enforcement of every regulation in the household manual, but the much harder, much more judgment-dependent task of keeping a house full of young people functioning, productive, and reasonably content across years of genuinely demanding work. Looking away in this particular case was not negligence. It was, properly understood, its own quiet form of skilled management. The kind that never appears in any record because its entire value lies in having left no record behind at all. Let us talk plainly for a moment about exhaustion, because it sits underneath everything we have described tonight, the early fires and the careful vanishing and the choreographed dinner service, and it deserves to be named directly rather than left as background texture to everything else. A housemaid's day in a house like this one, beginning before 5:30 and not properly concluding until well past 11 most nights, represented a physical toll that the era's own medical understanding only partially recognized, and that the household structure itself made almost no formal accommodation for at all. There was no concept in this world of a maximum working day, no expectation of regular rest beyond the single half-day granted weekly, no formal recognition that a human body asked to climb stairs carrying coal and water dozens of times daily year after year would eventually begin to break down in entirely predictable ways. The injuries that surface in below stairs accounts from this period are, read together, genuinely sobering. Burns from the kitchen range, common enough that most experienced cooks carried visible scarring on their forearms by middle age. Backs strained permanently from years of lifting, bending, scrubbing floors on hands and knees with a stiff brush, a posture that produced by a servant's 40s a particular stooped quality to the spine that contemporary observers occasionally noted with a kind of detached curiosity, as simply characteristic of servants generally, without much apparent interest in why that characteristic existed at all. Hands ruined by years of harsh soda crystals and constant immersion in water, a condition Bess was already beginning to develop at 14, and would likely carry in some permanent form for the remainder of her working life regardless of what kind of work she eventually moved on to. And then there was illness, which carried its own particular danger in this world, because a servant too unwell to work was in most households a servant temporarily or permanently unable to earn the wage that constituted their entire livelihood, with no formal sick pay, no guaranteed position waiting for them on recovery, only the personal discretion of whoever employed them, which varied enormously from one household to the next. Some employers, and this house counted by most accounts among the better ones in this particular respect, kept a servant on through a genuine illness, covering their duties among the remaining staff, and absorbing the temporary inefficiency as simply part of running a household with actual human beings in it. Other households dismissed a sick servant within days, sometimes hours, the position simply too valuable to leave unfilled for the sake of someone who could, after all, always be replaced by another girl from another village equally desperate for the wage. This precariousness shaped below stairs loyalty in ways that I think are easy to misunderstand if you only look at it from the outside. A servant who stayed in one household for decades, as Mr. Aldous had, as Mrs. Heron had, was not simply demonstrating sentimental attachment to a family that had in any conventional sense given remarkably little back in return. They were also, quite rationally, protecting something genuinely valuable, a known quantity, a household whose particular dangers and particular kindnesses had become familiar enough to manage safely against the considerable and very real risk of starting over somewhere entirely unknown, where a new employer's temperament, a new household's actual treatment of its staff during illness or hardship, remained an open question that could only be answered the hard way through direct and sometimes costly experience. And yet, and this is the part I keep circling back to, the loyalty that developed inside this practical calculation frequently became something more than the calculation itself eventually required. Mrs. Heron could very likely have secured a position elsewhere at considerably better wages, given her reputation among cooks in the region by this stage of her career. She stayed, by her own occasional brief admission, partly from simple comfort with a kitchen she knew completely, every quirk of every oven, every particular preference of every family member she had cooked for across 2 decades, but partly, too, from something genuinely harder to name, a kind of accumulated investment of self into a place and a set of people that had, over enough years, become something closer to her own life's actual shape, regardless of how unevenly that life had been acknowledged by the people she had spent it serving. This is not a comfortable thing to sit with, the idea that real devotion can grow inside a relationship this fundamentally unequal. I do not think it should make us comfortable. I think it is simply true, and history, when we let it be honest with us, is very rarely interested in being comfortable at all. There is one more piece of the system worth understanding properly before we let this particular night finish, because it explains so much of why discretion below stairs ran as deep as it did, and it is the character reference, a document that held more practical power over a servant's entire future than almost anything else in this world. When a servant left one position for another, the new employer would, as a matter of near universal practice, request a written character from the previous household, a letter, usually composed by the housekeeper or the master himself, describing the servant's conduct, honesty, and general suitability for service. Without a good character, a servant's prospects narrow dramatically and immediately, since no respectable household would knowingly take on staff who came without one, or whose previous employer had refused to provide it. This single mechanism, simple as it sounds, gave employers an almost total power over a servant's entire future livelihood that extended well beyond the period of actual employment itself. A housemaid dismissed for some genuine fault, theft, drunkenness, repeated insolence, might find herself effectively unemployable in respectable service anywhere in the country, her entire trained skill set suddenly worthless without the paper that vouched for her character. But the system's danger ran deeper than punishing genuine faults. A servant who had displeased an employer for reasons having nothing to do with actual misconduct, who had perhaps refused an improper advance from a son of the house, or simply fallen out of favour through some misunderstanding never properly resolved, could find her character quietly, devastatingly damaged, with no formal appeal available to her whatsoever, no court she could petition, no record she could correct. Understanding this single fact recontextualizes almost everything we have discussed tonight about the silence and discretion running through below stairs life. It was not simply tradition, or training, or some innate Victorian talent for keeping secrets. It was, underneath all of that, a rational and necessary response to a system in which a servant's entire future depended on the continued good opinion of people who held nearly unlimited power to destroy that future with a single unfavourable sentence in a letter. Loyalty in this world was not purely sentimental. It was also, quite literally, the only available insurance a servant had against a system offering almost no other protection at all. And so what happened eventually to people who had spent 30-40 years inside this system, when their bodies finally gave out the work their employment had always demanded of them? The honest answer is that it varied enormously, and not always in ways that reward our hope for a tidy moral resolution. Some long-serving staff in households that genuinely valued the decades of loyalty given to them were kept on in lighter duties as they aged. An old butler perhaps moved to a less physically demanding supervisory role, a cook allowed to train a successor while her own duties gradually reduced, sometimes with a small pension or a continued allowance arranged informally by a grateful family who recognized, in whatever limited way their own world allowed them to recognize it, that they owed this particular person something real. Other households, considerably more common by most historical accounts than we might wish, simply let aging servants go when their usefulness diminished, with no pension, no continued support, no acknowledgement whatsoever of decades given in service beyond, perhaps, a final character reference and whatever small savings the servant had managed to set aside across a lifetime of modest wages. A scullery maid who began at 12 and worked steadily into her 60s, assuming her body lasted that long without giving out entirely, might find herself at the very end of a working life spent entirely in service to other people's comfort, with remarkably little comfort secured for her own old age, dependent on whatever family she still had, or on the parish, or simply on whatever charity a community could be persuaded to extend to a woman nobody outside her own small circle had ever particularly noticed at all. I think this is the genuinely difficult truth sitting at the centre of tonight's story, the one I do not want to soften simply because softening it would feel more comfortable to fall asleep to. The loyalty was often real. The devotion many of these people felt toward families who barely saw them as full human beings was, in case after documented case, genuine and lasting and not in any simple sense manufactured by fear alone, and that loyalty was, just as often, simply never returned in kind, not equally, not even closely, by a world that had built an entire elaborate architecture, physical and social both, specifically to ensure these people's labor remained visible only in its results and never in the cost of producing them. Let us slow down even further now, because the night itself is deepening, and there is a particular object I want to linger on before we move towards sleep ourselves, since it carries more weight than its size would ever suggest. Mrs. Pell's keys, the actual ring of them she wears fastened at her waist throughout every waking hour of every day, number perhaps a dozen, each one opening a different door or cupboard somewhere in this house. The linen press where the household's entire stock of sheets, towels, and table linen is kept catalogued and counted with an exactness that borders on the devotional. The store cupboard holding sugar, tea, dried fruit and spices expensive enough to require locking away from casual pilfering. The china closet, the good silver's secondary storage separate from Mr. Aldous' own pantry, even, in some houses, a small locked cabinet holding the household's modest supply of medicines and remedies. These keys represented something the household manuals of the era discussed with surprising frankness, an entire economy of trust running through the housekeeper's body quite literally, since she alone carried on her own person the physical means of accessing nearly everything valuable enough in this house to need protecting from anyone, family included, who might be tempted to take more than their fair share. A new housekeeper taking up a position in an unfamiliar house was handed this ring of keys in a small, almost ceremonial moment that every account describes with a certain weight, because receiving the keys meant, in the most literal sense available, receiving the family's trust in physical, jangling form, a trust that could be lost in a single moment of carelessness or theft, and that, once lost, was almost never restored. Mrs. Pell counts the linen monthly, a task she performs alone, in her own small room, checking each item against a ledger kept for exactly this purpose, replacing what is worn beyond mending, noting what needs replacing soon, a quiet, unglamorous accounting that nonetheless represented real financial responsibility, since household linen, replaced wholesale, constituted a genuine expense that a careless or dishonest housekeeper could allow to spiral badly out of control, without anyone above stairs noticing until the bills arrived considerably larger than expected. There is something almost meditative in picturing her there, by candlelight, running a practiced hand over folded sheets, murmuring counts to herself, a woman whose entire professional identity rests on precisely this kind of patient, careful, invisible competence that nobody upstairs will ever think to ask about, let alone thank her for. The house's own sleeping arrangements for the staff themselves sat at the very top of the building, attic rooms tucked beneath the roofline where the ceiling sloped low enough that a person of ordinary height could not stand fully upright near the outer walls, rooms that grew bitterly cold in winter and uncomfortably warm in summer, since they sat directly beneath slate or tile that offered almost no insulation against whatever the season happened to be doing outside. Bess shares her small room with another scullery maid roughly her own age, the two narrow iron beds positioned close enough together that conversation in low voices after the candle was extinguished became, over months, one of the few genuinely private pleasures either girl had access to at all, a nightly ritual of whispered talk about absolutely nothing of consequence that nonetheless mattered enormously simply because it belonged entirely to them and to no one else in the house. Privacy, in the fuller sense we might recognize the word now, barely existed for staff at this level of the household at all. A housemaid's letters from home, if she received any, might be read by a literate companion if she could not read well herself, a small kindness that nonetheless meant her own family's news passed through at least one additional set of eyes before reaching her properly. Her few possessions, a hairbrush, perhaps a small framed likeness of a parent or sibling, a Bible given at confirmation, fit easily into a single small trunk kept at the foot of her bed, the entire material record of a life compressed into a space smaller than many people now keep for shoes alone. And yet within these narrow physical and material constraints, something recognizably human kept finding room to exist anyway. Friendship, small joys, private jokes, a particular comfort found in the sound of another person breathing steadily in the dark a few feet away. Proof, if proof were ever needed, that the urge toward connection survives almost any constraint a system can build around it. There is a room in this house we have not yet visited tonight, tucked near the kitchen but distinct from it, called the still room, and it belonged in households of this size to its own particular specialist, a still-room maid whose entire domain involved the household's preserves, cordials, and home remedies, a kind of domestic pharmacy and pantry combined that modern visitors to surviving country houses often walk straight past without realizing quite how much quiet expertise it once represented. The still-room maid in this house, a steady, soft-spoken woman named Margaret, who has held the position for nearly 9 years, spends entire days through the late summer and autumn months turning the kitchen garden's abundance into jams, bottled fruit, and pickled vegetables that will sustain the household's table through winter months when fresh produce becomes scarce and expensive. But preserves were only half of Margaret's responsibility, and the other half tells you something genuinely interesting about how a Victorian household managed health in an era when calling a physician for every minor complaint was neither affordable nor, frankly, considered necessary by most people of any class. Margaret kept a small private store of remedies, learnt partly from her own mother, partly from a recipe book passed down through several still-room maids before her, containing instructions for treating coughs, headaches, upset stomachs, and minor burns using ingredients she grew, dried, and prepared herself. Lavender water for headaches, a horehound and honey mixture for coughs that several of the younger staff swore by considerably more than any chemist's bottle, a simple poultice of bread and milk for drawing out a splinter or soothing a minor scald. This still-room knowledge occupied an interesting middle position in the household's overall medical hierarchy. The family upstairs, for anything serious, called a physician from the nearest town, a costly and somewhat formal process reserved for genuine illness. But for the dozens of small daily complaints that afflict any household full of working bodies, a headache from too little sleep, a minor burn from the kitchen range, a stomach upset from food eaten too quickly between tasks, it was Margaret's still-room that staff and, on occasion, even family members quietly turned to first, a kind of accumulated folk competence that modern medicine would later dismiss rather too quickly as superstition, though a fair portion of it, the honey for coughs, the cool compress for fever, has survived essentially unchanged into the present because it simply worked well enough to be worth keeping. A household's rhythm through a full year, beyond the daily cycle we have spent tonight inside, followed its own larger pattern that every servant eventually learned to anticipate the way a farmer learns to anticipate seasons. Spring brought the great cleaning, an undertaking considerably more thorough than anything attempted during the rest of the year. Every room stripped of its winter dressing, carpets taken up and beaten outdoors, curtains taken down and washed or replaced, chimneys swept properly rather than simply tended daily, an enormous undertaking that might occupy the entire staff's attention for the better part of 2 full weeks on top of their ordinary duties, performed specifically in the weeks before the social season properly began and guests started arriving in earnest. For households wealthy enough to maintain both a London townhouse and a country estate, as this family did, the year also involved an enormous seasonal migration, the bulk of the family's household moving to London for the spring and early summer season, then returning to the country for autumn and winter, a transition that required closing one house properly, dust sheets thrown over furniture, certain staff left behind as a skeleton crew to maintain the property, while most of the senior staff travelled with the family to open and run the second residence as though it had never stood empty at all. Mr. Aldous had overseen perhaps 20 of these transitions across his career, each one a logistical undertaking of real complexity, silver and certain favoured pieces of furniture sometimes travelling between the two houses, depending on which residence currently held the family's primary attention, an entire household's material life in constant, carefully managed motion between 2 fixed points across the calendar year. Here is something worth sitting with, the kind of thought that tends to arrive late at night and refuse to leave quietly. Almost everything we actually know about lives like the ones we have spent tonight inside comes from a remarkably thin thread of surviving evidence, a handful of memoirs written decades later by former servants who happen to be unusually literate, a scattering of household account books that record wages and purchases, but almost nothing of the people behind them, occasional letters that survived by accident rather than design, and the household manuals themselves, written not by servants but about them, prescribing how they should behave rather than describing how they actually felt while doing it. For every Mr. Aldous or Mrs. Heron whose general shape we can reconstruct with reasonable confidence from patterns documented across many similar households, there were thousands upon thousands of actual individual people whose entire interior lives, their private jokes, their small griefs, their particular way of humming while they worked, or the specific thing that always made them laugh, vanished completely the moment they themselves did, leaving no trace in any archive anywhere. This is the asymmetry we touched on at the very beginning of tonight's story, and it is worth returning to now that we understand its full shape. The family whose name sits carved above this house's front door will be traceable for centuries, in parish records, in portraits, in the family's own carefully preserved correspondence, in the house itself, which will likely still be standing, in some form long after every person currently sleeping or working inside it tonight has been entirely forgotten. Bess, Edith, Thomas, Alice, Harriet, Mrs. Pell, Mrs. Heron, Margaret in her still room. Even Mr. Aldous himself, despite his 30 years of genuinely significant responsibility, will leave behind, in all likelihood, nothing more than a name in a parish register and perhaps a line or two in a household ledger noting wages paid across however many years they happen to serve. And yet, and this is the part I keep returning to, the actual house, the actual family, the actual life that family lived and that history will eventually choose to remember, existed only because of these people every single day for as long as any of them remained in service here. Take away Mr. Aldous and the household's entire financial and social machinery falters within weeks. Take away Mrs. Heron and the family's reputation for gracious entertaining, the very reputation their social standing partly depends on, collapses just as quickly. Take away Bess, multiplied across the dozens of scullery maids and hall boys and kitchen maids whose individual names we will genuinely never recover, and the entire elaborate structure simply stops because somebody always had to light the fire that warmed the water that filled the basin that let a lady wash her face before a single other thing in her entire carefully managed day could happen at all. There is no tidy moral I want to hand you here. No neat conclusion that resolves the unfairness of all this into something comfortable enough to fall asleep beside. The unfairness is simply real, and it sits alongside, awkwardly, genuinely, the equally real fact that within this unfair structure, actual lives were lived, actual friendships were built, actual small joys were found in stolen afternoon hours and whispered conversations after the candle went out. Actual loyalty grew between people who had every rational reason not to extend it quite so generously and somehow extended it anyway. Both things are true at once. The system was unjust, built specifically to extract enormous labour while erasing all evidence that the labour had ever been performed by an actual person at all, and the people trapped inside that system were never themselves reducible to the injustice surrounding them. They remained, every one of them, considerably more than the house ever asked them to be. Bess's own family lives in a village perhaps 6 miles distant, close enough that her half-days granted weekly in this particular household, which by below-stairs reputation runs somewhat more generously than several neighbouring estates, allow her to walk home and spend a few precious hours with her mother and her 3 younger siblings before walking back in time for evening duties. Her wages, modest as they are, represent a genuinely meaningful contribution to a household that would otherwise struggle considerably more than it already does. Her father working as an agricultural labourer whose own wages fluctuate with the seasons in ways that hers, steady and predictable, do not. This detail matters enormously when we try to understand why a 14-year-old girl would choose, or more accurately, why her family would choose for her, this particular kind of difficult, exhausting work over whatever alternatives a rural village in 1883 actually offered a girl her age. The alternatives, frankly, were not abundant. Agricultural work for women existed but paid considerably less and offered none of the housing or food that service provided as part of the wage. Factory work existed in the nearest mill towns but required either relocating entirely away from family or a daily journey that most rural families could not easily arrange. Domestic service, whatever its genuine hardships, which we have spent considerable time tonight detailing honestly rather than romanticizing away, offered something most other available work for a girl Bess's age and background simply did not: steady wages, food, shelter, and a recognized path of advancement that might, with enough years and enough demonstrated competence, eventually lead somewhere considerably better than where she started. Edith's own trajectory from scullery work toward an eventual cook's position represented exactly the kind of advancement that made the hardship of the early years feel, to those who endured it successfully, like an investment rather than simply a punishment. Letters travelled between this house and the wider world with reasonable regularity, the postal system of this era functioning with an efficiency that surprises people who assume Victorian communication moved at a uniformly glacial pace. A letter posted from this house in the morning might reach London by the following day, and news from London, in turn, reached the household within roughly the same span, meaning that despite the physical isolation of a country estate, the people living and working inside it remained considerably more connected to broader events than the image of an isolated rural household might suggest. Mr. Aldous read a newspaper most days, a few days delayed from London publication, but otherwise complete, and below stairs conversation occasionally touched on events well beyond this house's own walls. A political controversy, a notable crime reported in lurid detail, the ongoing business of an empire most of these servants would never personally see any part of beyond what arrived, second-hand, through ink on cheap paper. This connection to the wider world mattered particularly for staff whose own families lived at some distance, since news of illness or hardship at home arrived through exactly this same slow but reliable channel, and a servant receiving difficult news from a letter might find herself, within the same hour, expected to resume her ordinary duties with whatever composure she could manage, grief and worry folded carefully out of sight behind whatever task currently required her hands and her attention. Mrs. Pell, to her genuine credit by every account that survives of households like this one, generally allowed staff a private moment to absorb difficult news before requiring them back to work, a small kindness that cost the household nothing in any measurable sense, and that the servants receiving it, by all accounts, genuinely valued considerably more than its smallness might suggest. It is past midnight now, properly late, and the task of finally securing the house for the night falls, in this household, to Mr. Aldous himself, a duty he has performed personally every single night for 30 years rather than delegating it to a footman, partly from a genuine sense that the house's security represented his ultimate responsibility, and partly, one suspects, from a quieter satisfaction in this particular small ritual, the last private hour of his own long working day, walking the ground floor alone with a single lamp, checking each window latch, each door bolt, the particular creak of the boot room door that he has been meaning for several years now to ask the estate carpenter to address and somehow never quite gets around to mentioning. The sound of this nightly round has its own particular rhythm that everyone in the household, family included, has long since absorbed into the unconscious soundtrack of the house at rest. A slow, measured footstep moving from room to room, a pause here and there as a latch is tested, the soft click of a bolt sliding home, occasionally the low murmur of Mr. Aldous speaking quietly to himself, a habit of counting doors aloud that he developed decades ago and has never entirely abandoned even now, that the count rarely varies from one night to the next. The gas is extinguished room by room as he passes through, the house growing progressively darker behind him, until finally only his own single lamp moves through a building that has, in every other respect, gone fully and properly to sleep. He checks the dining room last, always, a habit rooted in decades of experience that taught him this particular room held the greatest concentration of valuable, lockable items requiring his personal attention. The silver returned properly to its locked cupboard, the wine cellar's own separate lock tested and found secure, a small leather notebook in his waistcoat pocket, where he records each night the briefest possible note of anything requiring follow-up the next morning, a window catch that needs attention, a guest's particular request for breakfast that the kitchen should be informed of before the household properly wakes. This notebook, accumulated across years, represents its own small private archive, a record of decades of nights very much like this one, each entry brief enough to seem almost meaningless on its own and collectively, taken together, a genuine document of an entire working life that nobody beyond Mr. Aldous himself will likely ever read in full. Upstairs by this hour, every member of the family and their guests has retired fully, the house's grandest rooms sitting dark and empty in a way that feels, walking through them this late with only a single lamp for company, almost strange after a day spent making them appear so thoroughly, continuously alive. Mr. Aldous pauses occasionally in these empty rooms, not from any particular sentiment, but simply from the habit of decades, checking a fire's embers, straightening a chair pushed slightly out of place during the evening's entertainment, small final acts of care performed for rooms that will not register the care at all, that exist in this exact moment, purely for Mr. Aldous's own quiet professional satisfaction in leaving every single thing exactly as it ought to be before he too finally allows himself to climb toward whatever sleep the next few hours might offer before 5:30 arrives again, and the entire cycle resumes precisely where it left off. This is, I think, one of the most genuinely moving images in this whole story, though it would never have occurred to anyone living through it to think of it that way at the time. A man alone in a vast, dark, silent house at 1 a.m, the only person awake in a building that holds perhaps 30 other sleeping souls, walking slowly through rooms grander than anywhere he himself will ever actually live, checking locks and embers with a careful, unhurried attention that nobody will ever witness or thank him for, simply because the house's safety through the night depends on someone performing exactly this task, exactly this carefully, and he has decided across 30 years that this someone will always, without exception, be him. Harriet's own path into service, since we have spent so much of tonight inside her particular vantage point, followed a route fairly typical for a woman in her position, though typical, in this world, still meant something considerably more specific and personal than the word usually suggests. She began at 16 as an ordinary housemaid in a smaller household 2 counties over, demonstrating early on a particular skill with hair and a genuine, careful attentiveness that the housekeeper of that house noticed and, recognizing real potential, recommended for training as an underlady's maid when the position became available. The training itself, informal but rigorous, involved learning not merely the practical skills, hairdressing, the care of fine fabrics, the proper lacing of various undergarments fashion currently demanded, but also the considerably harder skill of discretion itself, taught less through direct instruction than through careful observation of senior maids who modelled, day after day, exactly the kind of seen-nothing, heard-nothing composure the position would eventually require of her completely. She has, across 11 years in her current position, watched her own prospects for marriage narrow considerably, a fact she has mentioned only once as far as anyone below stairs can recall, in a rare unguarded moment shared with Mrs. Heron some years back, a lady's maid's hours demanding and often unpredictable, particularly during the season when a mistress's social calendar might require attendance at odd hours with little advance warning, made courtship genuinely difficult to sustain, and Harriet, by her own quiet accounting, had let 2 reasonably promising attachments lapse over the years, simply through lack of available time and energy to properly cultivate either one into something more lasting. She does not describe this with obvious bitterness, at least not in front of others, though Mrs. Heron, who has known her longest among the current staff, suspects there is more feeling beneath the composed surface than Harriet has ever directly admitted to anyone, herself very possibly included. What Harriet has instead, after 11 years, is a modest but genuinely meaningful accumulation of savings, set aside carefully from wages that, for a senior lady's maid in a house of this standing, run considerably higher than a housemaid's, supplemented occasionally by small gifts from a grateful mistress after a particularly demanding season successfully managed. Her private hope, mentioned to almost no one, involves eventually saving enough to open a small millinery shop in a market town, a different kind of independence than marriage might have offered, but one that appeals to her, she has admitted in that same rare unguarded moment, precisely because it would finally be entirely her own, answerable to no mistress's bell, no housekeeper's notebook of acceptable conduct, simply her own hands and her own modest stock of ribbon and felt, sold to whoever happened to walk through her own front door. There is a gentler thread running through this world too, one worth naming before we let the night finally close around us, because the entire texture of below-stairs life was not constant grinding hardship relieved only by stolen secret pleasures. Once a year, typically around the Christmas season, this household, like a great many others of its standing, hosted what was generally called the servants' ball, an evening when the usual hierarchy loosened considerably, the family themselves often attending for at least the opening dances, the master leading out the housekeeper for a formal turn around the floor, in a small ritual of inverted status that everyone present understood, for one evening only, as genuine rather than merely performed. The food on these occasions was generous, considerably more generous than the household's ordinary servants' meals and the family's own gifts to staff, distributed at Christmas according to a careful hierarchy of their own, small sums of money calibrated precisely to rank and years of service, occasionally a useful item of clothing or a length of good fabric for a housemaid clever enough with a needle to make something of it herself, represented a genuine if modest acknowledgement that the year's labour had been noticed, even if the acknowledgement itself remained, in its underlying logic, every bit as hierarchical as everything else governing this world. Bess still remembers with real fondness her first Christmas in this house 8 months ago now. The unfamiliar sweetness of an evening when nobody, for a few hours at least, was required to vanish into a doorway at the sound of an approaching footstep, where the music and the candlelight and the unaccustomed fullness of a good meal made the whole enormous, unequal machine of the household feel briefly, genuinely, almost like something closer to a family after all. Mrs. Pell herself carries her own quiet history, rarely discussed but occasionally glimpsed in small unguarded moments, much like the ones that have revealed Harriet's private hopes to us tonight. She is addressed by everyone in the household, family included, as Mrs. Pell, a courtesy title extended to housekeepers regardless of actual marital status, a small but telling piece of the era's logic, since the title itself signalled authority and seniority rather than any claim about an actual husband, and Mrs. Pell in fact has never married at all. She came into service at 15, considerably younger even than Bess, in a household 2 generations back from this one, and climbed steadily through every female rank available to her across nearly 30 years, housemaid to senior housemaid to under housekeeper to, finally, 8 years ago, housekeeper of this particular establishment, a position she has held with a thoroughness that several previous mistresses of the house, including the current one, have come to rely on rather more completely than perhaps either party would ever directly acknowledge. The choice not to marry, for a woman who reached the senior ranks of household management, was not always entirely a matter of pure personal preference, though Mrs. Pell, in the one occasion she has ever discussed it at all, framed it that way to Mrs. Heron with a certain firmness that suggested the framing mattered to her considerably. A housekeeper's position required residence within the household and total availability to its demands, in a way that marriage, with its own competing claims on a woman's time and presence, would have made genuinely difficult to sustain at the level Mrs. Pell had worked her entire adult life to reach. Some housekeepers of this era did marry, generally choosing husbands employed within the same broad world of domestic service, a butler or a senior manservant whose own career similarly depended on understanding exactly the demands such a marriage would need to accommodate. Mrs. Pell, by her own account, had simply never met a man whose presence in her life seemed worth the considerable professional compromise that marriage in her particular position would likely have required. What she has instead, after 30 years entirely within this world, is an authority and a competence that genuinely commands respect throughout the household, a respect that operates somewhat differently from the affectionate loyalty staff feel toward Mrs. Heron, or the quiet camaraderie that runs through the younger servants in their stolen afternoon hour. Mrs. Pell is not, by most accounts, an easy woman to feel warmly toward in any uncomplicated sense, her standards exacting, her tolerance for genuine carelessness essentially non-existent, her capacity for the kind of quiet protective mercy we saw extended toward Alice and Thomas balanced, always, against an equally real willingness to dismiss a servant outright when she judged the household's order genuinely required it. And yet beneath this exacting surface, the younger staff have learned, across months and years of working under her, that Mrs. Pell's standards exist for reasons that, examined honestly, generally serve the staff's own genuine interests as much as the family's. A well-run household with clear, consistently enforced expectations being, in practice, a considerably safer and more bearable place to work than a poorly run one where rules shift unpredictably according to whoever happens to be in a difficult mood that particular day. It would be easy, and I think genuinely unfair, to imagine the family upstairs in this story as villains, simply because the system surrounding them operated with such thorough unfairness toward the people serving it. The mistress of this house, lying asleep now in the room Harriet finished preparing for her hours ago, is not, by any account that survives of her, a particularly cruel woman, and in fact treats her own staff, within the considerable limits the era's assumptions placed on what treating staff well even meant, with a fairly consistent, ordinary decency. She does not know Harriet's private hopes for a millinery shop, does not know that Bess walks 6 miles home on her half-day to see a mother who needs the comfort of it nearly as much as Bess herself does not know that Thomas's hands shake very slightly each time he passes within a few feet of Alice during a formal dinner service, a tremor he has trained himself to control before it ever reaches the tray he carries. She does not know these things because the system she inherited and now presides over, without ever having consciously designed a single piece of it herself, was built brick by brick and bell by bell, specifically to ensure she would never need to know them at all. That is not malice on her part. It is something quieter and, in its own way, considerably sadder. An entire elaborate world constructed around the comfortable, unexamined absence of curiosity about the lives making that comfort possible. This particular world, the one we have spent tonight walking through so carefully, would not last very much longer than the lifetimes of the people currently sleeping or working inside it, though none of them, on this particular spring night in 1883, could have known how completely or how quickly the ground beneath their entire profession would eventually shift. The structure we have described tonight, the elaborate hierarchy, the architecture of separation, the enormous households requiring dozens of indoor staff to function at all, represented something close to the high watermark of domestic service in Britain, a system that had been growing steadily more elaborate and more universal among the wealthy for the better part of a century, and that would, within the lifetime of someone Bess's age, contract more dramatically than anyone currently below these particular stairs could possibly have anticipated. The forces that would eventually dismantle this world were already gathering, slowly, invisibly, somewhere beyond the edges of this estate, though their full effect remained decades away. New employment opportunities in offices and shops, considerably more attractive to a young woman than the long hours and constant supervision of domestic service, would gradually draw away exactly the kind of labor this household and thousands like it depended on. Domestic technology, gas and eventually electric lighting reducing the labor of lamps and candles, running water reducing the endless carrying of jugs and basins, would slowly chip away at the sheer physical scale of tasks a household staff needed to perform. And a war, still more than 30 years off from this particular evening, would eventually accelerate every one of these changes at a speed nobody currently sleeping in this house could have imagined. Pulling young men away from footman's livery and into uniform, opening factory and clerical work to women in numbers and on terms that domestic service had never offered. Leaving great houses across the country struggling, within a single generation, to staff themselves at anything resembling their previous scale at all. Bess, if she lived to see it, which her own life expectancy at this particular historical moment made entirely plausible, would likely witness this entire transformation firsthand, perhaps leaving service herself eventually for factory or shop work that paid better and demanded less of her physical presence around the clock. Perhaps watching from inside a shrinking profession as houses like this one by one across the decades, reduced their staff, closed their grandest rooms, eventually opened their doors to paying visitors rather than house party guests. The entire elaborate machine we have spent tonight examining gradually, quietly, dismantling itself piece by piece until what remains, in the century following tonight's particular evening, is mostly empty rooms, roped-off corridors, and the faint, persistent sense, walking through these surviving houses now, that something considerable once happened here that the rooms themselves can no longer quite explain. I find myself thinking, the more I sit with this, that there is something genuinely poignant in how thoroughly this world disappeared, considering how completely it once organized entire lives, entire careers, entire systems of pride and status and belonging for the people living inside it. Mr. Aldous' 30 years, Mrs. Heron's mastery of a kitchen, Harriet's hard-won discretion, all of it represented genuine skill, genuinely accumulated across real working lives, and almost none of it transferred forward into whatever came next, because the world requiring exactly these particular skills simply stopped existing within a generation or two of tonight's evening, leaving behind mostly silence, a handful of surviving memoirs, and great houses now visited by tourists who walk through grand drawing rooms admiring portraits while remaining for the most part entirely unaware that a second, equally complex world once ran continuously, invisibly, just beyond a door covered in green baize, holding up everything they have actually come to see. There is a phrase worth returning to now, the one that gave tonight's story its shape from the very beginning, the idea of secrets taken to the grave, and I want to be precise about what that actually meant in practice, because it was rarely the dramatic, scandalous secrecy we might imagine from the phrase alone. Most of what a servant carried silently out of a house like this one, and into old age, was not a single explosive revelation withheld for decades. It was something quieter and in its own way considerably more remarkable, an entire accumulated lifetime of small discretions so thoroughly internalized that discretion itself eventually stopped feeling like a choice at all, and simply became identity. Harriet asked decades from now, in some imagined old age we cannot actually witness tonight, what she remembered of her years in service would very likely describe the work itself, the hairstyles, the long hours, perhaps a fond memory or two of particular kindness shown to her, and would almost certainly say nothing whatsoever about the specific private griefs and tensions she absorbed inside that dressing room across 11 years, not from any continued sense of professional obligation to a household she had long since left, but because the habit of not telling had simply become, by then, indistinguishable from who she was. This is, I think, the genuinely strange and very human truth sitting underneath the more dramatic framing a title like tonight's naturally invites. The secret servants took to their graves were rarely dark in the way that phrase suggests. They were, far more often, simply the accumulated texture of other people's ordinary private lives, witnessed at impossibly close range, and then deliberately permanently set aside, not because keeping silent remained dangerous after so many years had passed, but because the silence itself had become, by the end of a long working life, something closer to a personal ethic than a professional requirement. A final, quiet form of loyalty extended toward people who would, in nearly every case, never know or particularly care that the loyalty had outlasted the employment that originally required it at all. Consider for a moment what this actually asks of a person, sustained not for a single dramatic moment but across an entire working lifetime. Mr. Aldous will very likely die, decades from now, having never spoken aloud to anyone outside this household's own walls about the missing candlesticks, the master's gambling, the death he helped manage so carefully that the family experienced their own grief as something the house simply absorbed without visible strain. Mrs. Heron will carry the housemaid's secret, the one she finally told tonight, only because the telling itself served a protective purpose for the younger staff sitting at her table, but which she has otherwise kept fully and completely private for years before tonight, and will keep just as completely afterward. This is not secrecy as withholding information that anyone particularly wants. It is secrecy as a discipline practiced daily, for decades, by people who built, almost without realizing they were building it, an entire private moral architecture around the simple, repeated act of choosing, again and again, not to say the thing they knew. I want to leave you with one further thought on this, because it feels important before we let this particular night finally close around us. We have spent this whole evening looking for the family's secrets, the gambling, the unsuitable suitor, the daughter sent away, and in finding them we have necessarily centered the family's story even while trying to tell a different one. But the servants had their own secrets too, separate entirely from anything they kept for the family's sake, secrets that belonged only to them. Bess has never told anyone in this house, not even Edith, about a fear she carries privately most nights, that her hands will simply give out one day the way her own grandmother's did, leaving her unable to work at all. Thomas has never told a single soul, Alice included, about a letter he received some months ago offering him a position in a London household at considerably better wages, an offer he turned down without explanation and has not mentioned since, for reasons that have everything to do with a housemaid he cannot quite bring himself to leave behind. These secrets, the small private ones belonging only to the people who held them, never travelled anywhere at all, up any staircase or down any corridor. They simply lived quietly inside each person carrying them, the way private things always do, regardless of what century or what house happens to be holding the person carrying them. Let us return briefly to something we touched on earlier without quite finishing: the particular visual presentation footmen like Thomas were required to maintain, because it tells you something about how thoroughly even a servant's own physical appearance had been converted into a kind of decoration serving the family's status, rather than the footman's own comfort or preference. Livery, the distinctive uniform footmen wore, was supplied by the household rather than purchased by the servant himself, typically in colours chosen to complement the family's own heraldic colours, or simply selected by the mistress as fashionable and flattering. A coat cut in a style that had changed remarkably little across decades, even as ordinary men's fashion moved considerably further along. Knee breeches and stockings that displayed a footman's legs in a manner contemporary critics occasionally noted, with a certain dry humour, would have struck most footmen as considerably more revealing than they might otherwise have chosen for themselves. The grandest, most traditional households of this era, particularly in London rather than the countryside, sometimes still required footmen to powder their hair for the most formal occasions, a practice considerably more associated with the previous century but lingering in pockets of especially status-conscious society. Well into the period we are visiting tonight, an elaborate and somewhat absurd process involving a sticky pomade worked through the hair, followed by actual powder dusted on top, the entire production undertaken purely for the visual effect of a footman's appearance during a formal dinner, with no functional purpose whatsoever beyond signalling, to any guest sophisticated enough to recognize the detail, exactly how seriously this particular household took its own presentation. This particular country house, somewhat less formal in this specific respect than its grandest London counterparts, had abandoned powdered hair for its footman some years back, though Mr. Alder still remembers the considerable extra labour it once required, and does not, by his own quiet admission, miss it in the slightest. Thomas's height, just over 6 feet, had genuinely factored into his hiring some years ago, since households of this standing actively sought taller footmen for the visual symmetry they created flanking doorways or standing at attention during formal service, a preference openly discussed in household staffing advertisements of the period in terms that, read now, feel almost startlingly direct about treating a man's physical appearance as a hiring criterion equivalent to his actual competence at the job itself. Thomas understood this calculation perfectly well, had understood it since his very first position years earlier, and carried no particular resentment about it that he has ever expressed, treating his own height simply as one professional asset among several others he had developed and refined across years of service, alongside his actual serving technique, his memory for which guest preferred which wine, his careful, well-practiced stillness during the long stretches of formal dinner service, when a footman's entire job consisted of standing motionless near a sideboard, alert and ready, for what might amount to well over an hour at a single stretch. The cost of maintaining this presentation fell, in nearly every respect, on the household rather than the footman himself. Livery replaced periodically as it wore. Gloves supplied fresh for formal occasions, the household even providing the particular pomade and powder on those grander occasions, still calling for it. But the labour of actually maintaining this appearance, the careful brushing and pressing of the livery itself, fell to Thomas's own hands during whatever spare moments his day happened to offer, a small daily task layered on top of everything else already asked of him, ensuring that the coat he wore each evening retained the crisp, unblemished appearance the household's reputation depended on, regardless of how thoroughly his own legs ached from a full day spent largely standing, or how little time remained, by the close of any given day for tending properly to his own modest, entirely unremarkable civilian clothing that nobody upstairs would ever once think to notice or comment on at all. A Victorian range, once properly fired in the morning, was banked rather than extinguished each night, which meant the kitchen itself never fully went cold even at this late hour. A careful process of arranging the remaining coals and adjusting the dampers to slow the fire to its lowest sustainable burn, just enough heat preserved overnight that the following morning's task of bringing the range back to full working temperature took considerably less time and considerably less precious coal than starting entirely from cold would have required. This single piece of practical knowledge, passed down through generations of cooks and kitchen maids, the same way most of this world's actual expertise passed along, through demonstration and correction, rather than any written manual anyone consulted directly, represented exactly the kind of invisible skill that made an entire household's morning function smoothly without a single person upstairs ever once considering how the kitchen had managed to produce a hot breakfast so reliably, so early, every single day without exception. Bess, before finally climbing the narrow attic stairs toward her own bed tonight, performs one final small task that has become, across her 8 months in this position, something close to a private ritual, checking the banked range one last time, adjusting a damper very slightly, ensuring the coals are arranged exactly the way Mrs. Heron prefers them left overnight. A small act of care that nobody will witness or specifically request of her tonight, but that she performs anyway, partly from simple professional thoroughness, and partly, she might admit if asked directly, from a quiet satisfaction in knowing she has left her own small corner of this enormous complicated household exactly as it should be before allowing herself to finally rest. There is something worth noticing in this particular detail, small as it is. Nobody requires Bess to check the range a final time before bed. Her actual assigned duties for the day have technically concluded already, the washing up finished, the kitchen otherwise in order, and yet she does it anyway, this small unrequested act of care, repeated nightly now for months, not from fear of consequence but from something that has, almost without her noticing it happen, become genuine pride in work done thoroughly and well. This is, I think, one of the quieter forms the loyalty we have discussed tonight actually took. Not the grand dramatic loyalty of guarding a family secret, but this smaller, more constant variety, showing up reliably in 100 tiny unrequested gestures that nobody above stairs would ever specifically notice, simply because doing the work properly, completely, had become its own private satisfaction regardless of whether anyone with the power to acknowledge it ever actually would. Outside, the night has settled fully over the estate now, the kind of deep, textured darkness that a house this far from any town centre still allowed in 1883, broken only by a single lit window somewhere in the stable block where a groom keeps a late watch over a mare due to foal any night now, and by the faint, steady glow of the gas lamp Mr. Aldous left burning very low near the main entrance, a small concession to safety that the household maintains every single night regardless of season. The gravel drive, swept clean each morning by the hall boy and already gathering a faint scatter of fresh debris blown in from the surrounding parkland, stretches pale and visible even in this darkness, curving away toward a distant gate that will not see another carriage until well past breakfast tomorrow. A barn owl calls somewhere beyond the kitchen garden, the particular thin, eerie shriek of it carrying easily across the still night air, answered a few moments later by a second call further off, the kind of ordinary rural night sound that everyone in this household has long since stopped consciously noticing, woven so thoroughly into the texture of life here that its absence on the rare night it failed to occur would likely register as stranger than its presence ever does. Somewhere closer, in the kitchen garden itself, something small moves through the rows of vegetables, a hedgehog perhaps, or simply the wind finding its way through leaves still damp from an earlier shower that passed through during the dinner hour, without anyone below stairs having time to properly notice it at all. The house itself, viewed from outside at this hour, presents a uniform dark face to the night, every window now unlit, every curtain drawn. Nothing visible from the drive to suggest that inside this single building, just hours earlier, an enormous, intricate machine of human labor had been running continuously, fires lit and meals prepared and silver polished and secrets carefully managed, all of it now stilled into this same uniform, peaceful darkness that any passing traveler, glancing toward the house from the road beyond its gates, would simply read as a great house, sleeping, the way great houses are generally assumed to sleep, with no particular thought given to the 30 or so people currently doing the actual work of that sleep, banking fires, locking doors, climbing narrow stairs toward their own narrow beds, before tomorrow's version of today begins again at 5:30, precisely on schedule, regardless of how little rest the intervening hours actually manage to provide. Inside, in the attic room she shares, Bess has finally climbed beneath her own thin blanket, the cold of the unheated attic space settling over her quickly despite the season, a cold she has learned across 8 months to simply absorb rather than fight, curling slightly to conserve whatever warmth her own body generates beneath bedclothes considerably thinner than anything kept ready for a guest 2 floors below. Her roommate, already half asleep, murmurs something indistinct, and Bess answers in the same low, automatic tone 2 people develop after months of sharing this particular nightly transition from waking to sleep. A few words about tomorrow's expected workload, a brief drowsy complaint about aching feet, and then silence, the particular silence of someone who has been awake and working since 5:30 that same morning, and has quite simply nothing left in reserve to keep her conscious very much longer at all. Across the narrow attic corridor, in rooms arranged according to the same careful hierarchy that governs every other space in this house, even here, even in the spaces nobody upstairs will ever see, Alice lies awake slightly longer than Bess managed to, turning over, in the last conscious minutes before sleep finally claims her too, the small private satisfaction of a day that had, despite its exhaustion, included those few stolen minutes at the servants' hall table with Thomas, his quiet voice, a joke shared between them that nobody else at the table had quite caught the meaning of. She thinks briefly about the conversation circulating earlier tonight regarding the housemaid from years past, the one Mrs. Heron finally told the story of, and feels something settle in her chest that she does not entirely have words for, a kind of confirmation that the careful, protective silence surrounding her own situation with Thomas belongs to something larger and older than just the 2 of them, a whole inherited tradition of servants quietly protecting each other that stretches back apparently considerably further than she had ever fully appreciated before tonight. Thomas himself, in the male servants' quarters on the opposite side of the attic floor, falls asleep rather more quickly, the particular dense, immediate sleep of someone whose entire day has been spent on his feet, alert, holding a careful stillness for hours at a stretch that costs more than people who have never tried it tend to assume. His last waking thought, by his own account given much later in life to someone who eventually asked him directly about these years, was simply Alice's face across the servants' hall table, an image that required no elaboration, no anxious turning over of unresolved feeling, simply a settled, quiet certainty that whatever else this particular life asked of him, this one thing at least felt entirely, simply right. Harriet, finishing her own much later night than most of the younger staff, having stayed in the dressing room considerably longer than usual tonight given the formal occasion's demands, finally reaches her own small room sometime after 1 in the morning, removing her own cap and apron with the same careful, practiced motion she has applied to her mistress's far more elaborate garments for the past several hours, before sitting for a few minutes on the edge of her narrow bed, simply allowing her own body to register fully just how tired 11 years of this exact work has actually made her, a tiredness that goes considerably deeper than tonight alone, settling into bone and joint in ways she has long since stopped expecting to fully recover from on any single night's rest. She thinks, before sleep finally takes her to, of the millinery shop, the ribbon and felt, the particular kind of ordinary, unremarkable independence that feels, on nights exactly like this one, considerably more valuable than it might on an easier day. Edith reads for perhaps 10 minutes by a single candle before her own eyes grow too heavy to continue, the borrowed novel propped against her knees. A single chapter consumed slowly, deliberately, the small private luxury of a story belonging entirely to herself, rather than to the household's endless collective demands, before she finally extinguishes the candle and allows the genuine exhaustion of the day to claim her completely. Mrs. Heron, in her own room just off the kitchen passage, sleeps lightly as she always does, one ear permanently tuned, even in sleep, to whatever sounds the kitchen below might make through the night, a habit so deeply ingrained across decades that she has long since stopped experiencing it as vigilance at all, simply as the ordinary, unremarkable texture of how she rests. Mrs. Pell completes one final check of her own, a brief walk through the ground floor service corridors before retiring fully, confirming that every younger member of staff has actually reached their own bed rather than lingering somewhere they ought not to be. A habit of quiet supervision extending even into these final private minutes of the day, performed not from suspicion exactly, but from the same thorough, exacting professionalism that governs every other hour of her working life. Mr. Aldous, his own nightly rounds finally complete, the house secured, the notebook in his waistcoat pocket holding its handful of brief notes for tomorrow, climbs toward his own quarters at last. The particular quiet satisfaction of 30 years accumulated competence settling over him as it does every single night. A man who has once again, today, kept an entire complicated world running smoothly enough that not one single person above stairs ever had reason to think about how or by whom or at what cost. The master of the house himself, lying awake rather longer than his sleeping wife beside him, turns over his own private worries in the dark. The gambling debts Mr. Aldous has so carefully and discreetly helped manage, worries his wife does not know the full extent of, and that he has shared with absolutely no one except, indirectly, through the practical necessity of settling actual bills, his own butler. He has no idea, lying here in the dark turning these figures over in his mind, how much Mr. Aldous already knows, how carefully his own butler has already smoothed over creditor correspondence that might otherwise have caused considerably more household embarrassment than it has, how the missing candlesticks sit, unexplained but quietly noted, in a private ledger of suspicions Mr. Aldous has decided, for reasons of his own, never to raise directly. The master assumes, in the comfortable, unexamined way people in his position generally do, that his own private anxieties remain genuinely private, known to himself alone, never once considering that the man who has served him faithfully for 30 years might understand his actual financial situation rather more completely, and rather more calmly, than he himself currently manages to. There is something almost gently comic in this, viewed from a slight distance, alongside everything more serious we have discussed tonight. An entire household of people deliberately carefully maintaining the fiction that the family upstairs exists in blissful ignorance of its own difficulties, while the family upstairs simultaneously assumes that very same ignorance to be genuinely complete, neither side quite recognizing how thoroughly the other has already seen through whatever they each imagined remained hidden. The master falls asleep eventually, his worries unresolved but somewhat eased simply by the ordinary exhaustion of a long evening of hosting, never once suspecting that the man locking the front door downstairs an hour earlier already held, in a small leather notebook and an even smaller, more private mental ledger, a considerably more accurate accounting of the family's actual situation than the master himself, for all his anxious calculating in the dark, currently possessed. Think for a moment of all the small objects we have met tonight, scattered now through a sleeping house, each one waiting quietly for tomorrow's hands to find it again. The coal scuttle, empty now, resting beside a range banked low for the night. The bootjack by the back door, waiting for tomorrow's mud. The knife board propped in its corner of the scullery, the blacking and brushes arranged on their shelf exactly where the hallboy left them. candle snuffers resting on mantelpieces throughout the darkened house, having done their small quiet work for the final time tonight, a copper warming pan, cooling now on its hook near the kitchen door, its job finished until the next cold evening calls for it again, flat irons cooling slowly on their stand near the range, ready to be heated fresh come morning, a housekeeper's ring of keys, resting now on Mrs. Pell's own bedside table rather than at her waist. The only hour of the day she ever sets them down at all. Every single one of these ordinary objects represents, in its own small way, an entire skill, an entire history of someone learning exactly how to use it well, exactly how much pressure or heat or care a particular task required, knowledge passed down hand to hand, generation to generation, almost none of it ever written in any book that survives, most of it simply lived, repeated daily until it became as natural and unremarkable as breathing, and then eventually within a lifetime or two of tonight's particular evening, largely forgotten entirely, set aside as the world that required this exact knowledge quietly, gradually, ceased to exist at all. There is one more detail about the bell system worth mentioning before we let this night fully settle, because it complicates the comfortable image we might otherwise carry away of every servant now genuinely, completely off duty until 5:30 tomorrow morning. The bells did not stop functioning simply because the household's senior members had gone to sleep. A guest unable to sleep, troubled by indigestion after a heavy meal, might still ring for assistance at 2 or 3 in the morning, and somewhere below stairs a designated night servant, rotated through the staff according to a schedule Mrs. Pell maintained with her usual careful precision, remained genuinely, formally on call through the entire night, sleeping lightly enough in a room positioned close enough to hear a bell's distant ring, to respond within minutes regardless of the hour. Tonight, this particular duty falls to one of the under-housemaids, a young woman who will sleep, if she sleeps at all, in a state of partial readiness that never quite allows for the deep, complete rest the rest of the staff currently enjoy, listening, even in sleep, for a sound that may very well never come tonight at all, since most nights pass without a single ring disturbing the household's full rest. But the readiness itself, sustained night after night regardless of how rarely it was actually called upon, represented its own particular kind of labour, invisible even by the standards of everything else we have discussed tonight, a form of work that consisted entirely of remaining available, just in case, for an entire night that the people requiring that availability would never once think to acknowledge or thank her for, precisely because, on most nights, nothing happened at all, and an absence of crisis registers, to the people sleeping comfortably through it, as simply nothing worth noticing whatsoever. This detail matters because it reveals something true about the entire system we have spent tonight examining, that the labour required to maintain this household's comfort never actually stopped, not completely, not even for a single hour across the full daily cycle, that beneath the visible rhythm of fires lit at dawn and dinners served at night ran a second, quieter rhythm of permanent, low-level readiness, that simply never switched off entirely for anyone holding a position of genuine responsibility within this house. Mrs. Pell herself, technically off duty at this hour, would still be the first person summoned if any genuine emergency arose overnight. Fire, sudden illness, a servant taken seriously unwell, and some part of her, even in sleep, remained permanently, faintly attuned to exactly this possibility, a vigilance she has carried for 30 years now, and has long since stopped experiencing as a burden at all, simply as the unremarkable, permanent shape her own particular kind of rest has always taken. The hall boy, whose name in this house is Daniel, just turned 13 this past winter, sleeps in a small room near the boot room rather than up in the main attic with the other male staff, a placement determined partly by his lowest rank among the male servants, and partly by simple practicality, since his earliest duties tomorrow morning will require him to be moving before nearly anyone else in the house, including Bess, gathering boots left outside doors and beginning the long process of blacking and polishing that consumes the first hours of his every single working day. Daniel's position is, by every account of households like this one, the hardest entry point available in domestic service, the lowest possible rank, the most physically demanding combination of menial tasks, the least protection from a senior servant's temper on a difficult day, and yet it represents, for a boy his age from a labouring family, a genuinely meaningful first step on a ladder that, if he applies himself and survives the considerable hardship of these earliest years, could eventually lead toward a footman's position, and perhaps decades from now, something approaching what Mr. Aldous himself has achieved. Daniel thinks about this sometimes in the brief minutes before sleep claims him each night, a boy's private, half-formed ambition to become, someday, exactly the kind of man Mr. Aldous currently is, commanding real respect, holding real responsibility, having climbed, through sheer patient years of demonstrated competence, from precisely the position Daniel himself currently occupies, all the way to the very top of what a male servant in this world could realistically hope to become. He does not yet fully understand, at 13, quite how long and difficult that particular climb actually is, how many years of cold mornings and aching hands, and a senior servant's occasional sharp correction stand between where he currently sleeps and where Mr. Aldous now rests 2 floors above him. But the hope itself, modest and entirely reasonable given everything he has already observed of how this particular household actually rewards patient, demonstrated loyalty over time, keeps him moving forward through each difficult day with rather more genuine optimism than his current circumstances, viewed coldly from the outside, might otherwise seem to justify at all. The female staff's own uniforms, worth a brief mention before we finally let this house rest completely, followed their own precise hierarchical logic that visitors to the house could read at a glance, the same way a soldier's insignia communicates rank without requiring a single word of explanation. A housemaid's morning uniform consisted typically of a printed cotton dress in some practical, hard-wearing pattern, suitable for the dirtier work of fires and grates performed before the family rose, covered with a plain apron that bore the visible evidence of the day's labour by mid-morning, regardless of how carefully its wearer worked. By afternoon, once the heaviest cleaning had concluded, and any risk of encountering family members in the corridors increased considerably, housemaids changed into a different uniform entirely, a black or dark-coloured dress, considerably smarter, paired with a fresh white apron and cap, the visible signal that the morning's dirty work had concluded, and the more presentable afternoon duties, answering doors, serving afternoon tea, moving through rooms where a guest might actually glimpse her, had now begun. This change of dress, performed daily without exception, required its own small allocation of time and effort that, multiplied across every housemaid in the building, represented a meaningful additional task layered onto an already demanding schedule, and the uniforms themselves, supplied partly by the household and partly purchased by the servant from her own modest wages depending on the specific arrangement each house maintained, needed constant laundering and mending to remain presentable, a responsibility that fell, in most households, to the housemaid's own off-duty hours, rather than to any laundry maid's assistance, since personal uniform care sat outside the formal division of household laundry duties entirely. The cap itself, small, white, trimmed with a modest edge of lace or simple ribbon depending on the wearer's rank, carried its own particular symbolic weight that the era's social commentary occasionally addressed directly, a visible marker that distinguished a domestic servant instantly from any other working woman a stranger might encounter on the street, a kind of permanent portable announcement of social position that a housemaid wore every single day of her working life, and that, for many former servants interviewed decades later about their years in service, became one of the details they remembered most vividly when the question of leaving service finally arose. The particular, almost startling freedom of choosing, for the first time in years, exactly what to put on one's own head each morning, without any household requirement dictating the choice at all. So here we are, very late now, the house entirely still, and I think it is worth pausing before we let sleep take us along with everyone we have spent tonight following through their day, to hold the whole shape of it together for just a moment. We began this evening behind a door covered in green baize, and we have spent every hour since moving through the world that door concealed, the narrow stairs and the bellboard and the strict careful hierarchy running from Mr. Aldous down to Daniel, the fires lit before dawn and the dinner served at midnight, and the small stolen minutes of genuine human connection that survived, somehow, inside a system built specifically to make the people sustaining it disappear. We have met a butler who knows more about this family's true financial situation than the family itself does, and has decided across 30 years to carry that knowledge silently rather than ever once using it as leverage or even simple conversation. We have met a lady's maid who has heard a marriage's private unhappiness across 11 years and has never repeated a single word of it to anyone, not even in any conscious or examined way to herself. We have met a housekeeper who looked away from a small romance because looking away in her considered professional judgment served everyone's genuine interests rather better than strict enforcement would have. We have met a scullery maid barely into her teenage years already developing the particular rough hands this work would mark her with for the rest of her life, and a hall boy younger still, already privately dreaming of a climb that will take him decades if it happens at all. None of these people, on this particular spring night in 1883, knew they were living through what historians would eventually consider something close to the high water mark of an entire vanishing world. They simply knew they were tired, and that tomorrow would ask exactly the same things of them that today had, and that somewhere in the small spaces between exhaustion and duty, something resembling an actual life, friendship, private hope, quiet loyalty, stubborn human warmth, kept finding room to exist anyway, the way it generally does, regardless of how thoroughly the architecture around it seems designed to prevent it. The family whose name sits carved above the front door will be remembered in some form for as long as the house itself stands, which may well be a very long time yet. Bess, Thomas, Alice, Harriet, Edith, Daniel, Mrs. Heron, Mrs. Pell, Mr. Aldous will not be remembered in any comparable way at all, their names surviving, if they survive anywhere, only in a parish register or a wage ledger that nobody will ever think to consult unless they happen to be searching, very specifically for exactly this kind of forgotten life. And yet it was their hands, every single one of them, that kept this house breathing through every hour of this particular day, their careful, invisible competence holding up an entire world that the family upstairs experienced simply as comfort, simply as ease, simply as the ordinary, unremarkable texture of a life that ran, somehow smoothly, without ever quite asking how. That is the secret in the end, the real one, the one worth carrying with you out of this house and into whatever rest finds you tonight. Not a single scandalous revelation, not a hidden affair or a missing set of candlesticks, though those existed too in their smaller way. The real secret this house kept, the one written nowhere and spoken aloud almost never, was simply this entire invisible world itself, vast and intricate and held together by people history never thought important enough to name, who kept the candles lit and the floors silent and every door closed at precisely the moment it needed closing, expecting nothing in return beyond a wage, a bed, and the small private dignity of work done thoroughly and well. The last candle in the house has gone out now, somewhere in the attic where Bess sleeps already, her roommate beside her, both of them breathing slow and even in the particular deep, dreamless way exhausted bodies finally rest. Down below, the kitchen range holds its low, banked warmth through the dark hours, the only heat left burning anywhere in this entire sleeping house. Outside, the owl has gone quiet. The gravel drive sits pale and empty under a sky finally clearing of the day's earlier rain, stars showing faintly through the last thin clouds. Somewhere past the kitchen garden wall, a fox crosses the open ground in 3 quick steps and vanishes into the dark tree line beyond, unseen, the way nearly everything in this story has been unseen, the way the truest parts of almost any house, any family, any life generally are. Behind it all, the green baize door sits closed now too, the way it always sits closed once the household's work for the day has finally concluded, holding its two separate worlds gently apart through the long, quiet hours until 5:30 arrives again, and somebody, somewhere below it, rises in the dark to begin lighting the very first fire of an entirely new day. If we let ourselves drift forward just slightly beyond this single night, the way memory sometimes drifts ahead of itself without quite meaning to, a few small threads of what became of these particular lives can still be traced, faintly, through the surviving fragments history happened to preserve. Harriet did eventually leave service, some years after the night we have spent with her, with savings finally sufficient to open a small shop in a market town not unlike the one she had always imagined, selling ribbon and trimmed hats to women who never once knew, glancing at her pleasant, composed face across the counter, that she had spent 11 years holding an entire household's private sorrows in careful, permanent silence, before arriving at this quieter, smaller, entirely her own life at last. Thomas stayed. He turned down that London offer, and others that came later too, and eventually when household rules around staff marriage finally loosened somewhat in later years, he and Alice were permitted to marry while both remaining in service, a small, modest ceremony attended by most of the staff we have met tonight, Mrs. Pell present and by Alice's own later account, visibly moved in a way nobody below stairs had ever quite seen from her before. They raised children eventually in a cottage on the estate's edge, a kind of quiet, ordinary happiness that the careful, frightened secrecy of their earliest years together could never have promised them outright, but that their patience and the protective discretion of everyone who had quietly looked away on their behalf ultimately made possible. Mr. Aldous served this house for a further 12 years beyond the night we have spent with him, retiring finally in his 60s with a modest pension the family did in the end choose to provide, a recognition, however incomplete, of exactly the kind of decades-long loyalty we have spent tonight trying to properly understand. He lived out his remaining years in a small cottage not far from the estate, visited occasionally by former colleagues, Mrs. Heron chief among them, the two of them sharing, in their own old age, the particular easy comfort of people who had once run an entire complicated world together and never needed to explain its weight to anyone else who had not also carried it. Bess grew older too, her hands roughening further with the years exactly as she had quietly feared they might, but she stayed in service for the whole of her working life, climbing eventually to housemaid and then, in her own middle years, to a position not unlike Edith's senior kitchen role, training younger girls exactly as frightened and exactly as capable as she herself had once been, passing along hand to hand the same accumulated unwritten knowledge that had once been passed along to her. Daniel did become a footman eventually, a tall, steady young man by the time he reached it, and there is some suggestion in the fragmentary record that survives that he went on, decades later, to hold a position rather like Mr. Aldous' own, in a different house, a different family, the same patient climb completed at last. None of this resolves the unfairness we spent so much of tonight examining honestly. The system remained what it was, built to extract enormous labour while erasing the people performing it, for as long as the system itself continued to exist at all. But within it, these particular lives found their own particular shapes, some harder than others, some considerably kinder than the house's own architecture ever intended to allow, and there is something worth holding on to in that, I think, as you drift now toward your own rest. Whatever house you are lying in tonight, whatever quiet, unglamorous labour keeps your own world running smoothly without anyone quite noticing how, you are part of the same old, ordinary human pattern these particular people lived inside more than a century ago, finding warmth and rest and small private hope in whatever corners a difficult world happens to leave open. The baize door stays closed, the candle stays out, and somewhere just beyond where this story ends, the house keeps its long, quiet watch through whatever remains of the night, the way it always has, the way it always will, until the first faint grey light finds its way back through the kitchen window, and somebody once again rises in the dark to begin. There is one final small detail about this world worth mentioning, since it captures, perhaps more economically than anything else we have discussed tonight, the entire asymmetry running underneath every single hour we have spent below these particular stairs. Senior servants, butlers and housekeepers and cooks were addressed by the family using their surname alone, Aldous, Pell, Heron, a form of address that carried genuine respect within its own particular register, acknowledging years of earned seniority without ever extending the more familiar courtesy of a title. No Mr., no Mrs. beyond the customary honorific Mrs. Heron and Mrs. Pell wore regardless of marital status. Junior staff, housemaids and footmen and scullery maids fared rather worse again, addressed simply by first name, Bess, Thomas, Daniel, the same easy, unceremonious familiarity an adult might extend to a child, regardless of how old the servant addressed this way actually happened to be, and the address never ran in the opposite direction at all. No servant in this house, regardless of rank, regardless of years served, would ever address a family member by first name alone, the family's own names reserved entirely for each other, and for guests of equivalent social standing, while every servant, even Mr. Aldous after 30 years of faithful service, addressed every single family member using their full formal title, Sir, My Lady, Miss, Master, every single time, every single day, without exception, for as long as they remained in the position at all. This small, constant, entirely one-directional formality, repeated so many thousands of times across a working lifetime that it eventually stopped registering as anything notable to anyone living inside it, told the truth of this entire world more plainly than almost anything else we might point to tonight. Intimacy ran one way, knowledge ran one way. Even the simple, ordinary courtesy of being called by one's own name, in one's own right, by the people sharing a roof with you every single day of your working life, ran in the end only one way too. Something else persisted anyway beneath even that. Something this whole careful architecture of separation and rank and quiet, permanent formality never quite managed to fully extinguish. A scullery maid who checked the range one final time before bed, simply because the work deserved doing properly. A butler whose own private notebook held 30 years of small, careful observations nobody else would ever read. A lady's maid who carried in complete silence the genuine private sorrows of a woman she would never once be permitted to call by her given name, and chose every single day for 11 years to carry that weight with real unrewarded tenderness anyway. This is what survived, underneath all the surnames and the titles and the strict, careful distance the whole system worked so hard to maintain. Not the family's comfort, though that survived too obviously, easily, exactly as the architecture intended, but something quieter and considerably harder to design into any house at all. The simple, stubborn, entirely human refusal of people to become only what the work asked of them. Even when every single structure surrounding their lives had been built deliberately to ensure that nobody watching would ever think to wonder whether they were anything more. The house is fully asleep now. Every fire banked, every door bolted, every candle out, every single person who kept this particular day running finally resting, however briefly, before tomorrow asks the same of them all over again. Wherever you are tonight, whatever quiet hour has carried you this far into the story, I hope something of this house's old patient stillness has settled over you too. Let it hold you. Let the dark be simply dark and kind, and let sleep find you exactly the way it found Bess and Thomas and Harriet and all the rest, gently, completely, and without asking anything more of you at all.